Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to call this August 12th study meeting of the Bloomington City Council to order. We have 6 different items on tonight's agenda, and we'll get to them in just a minute. But first, if we could, call the roll. Ms. Christensen, if you could please call the roll of the council.
Thank you. Councilmember Beloga.
Here.
Councilmember Carter.
Here.
Councilmember Coulter.
Present.
Councilmember Lohman.
Here.
Councilmember Nelson. I know he was having some audio troubles. I saw him online, but I do not see him online at this moment.
He indicated he's coming back in.
Okay, thank you. And Mayor Bussey.
Present. So we have 5 members of the City Council. I know that Councilmember Martin had a family obligation, is not able to join us this evening, and it sounds like Councilmember Nelson is fighting some technical issues, and we will acknowledge him when he is online and ready to go. With that, we'll dive right into our agenda for the evening, and we'll start with item 2.1, which is a summary of council interviews regarding the Park System Master Plan. Ms. Renee Clark, our Assistant Director of Parks and Park Projects, is going to lead us through this one. Good evening, Ms. Clark, and welcome. And I believe, there's Ann Catry as well. Good evening, Ann.
Good evening.
Hi there, Mayor and members of the council. Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor Bussey, members of council. In August and September, you all generously gave us your time to individually discuss how you view the Bloomington Park System today and provide us guidance on how to get there. A brief summary of that was provided in your packet. Tonight, I'm excited to report that the feedback that you all provided was really consistent, and we are using that to move ahead and make real progress, continue to make progress on the master plan. 3 main areas we discussed were the vision for our park system. You all generally really acknowledged the great park system we have today, but also saw the need for updating and to make improvements. We talked a bit about cost recovery and increasing fees, which was all supported as well, with a fee assistance program accompanied. Finally, a big area of discussion and really helpful feedback for staff was around capital improvement planning. There were 2 major concepts introduced. One was a service area planning framework that generally uses council districts to define service areas, which we would then look to create balance of amenities and experiences within each service area. Secondly, we talked about community-driven planning and design process for individual park improvements that were more substantial, maybe than just a playground replacement, but a bigger investment in a park. We would do a more comprehensive design and planning process with the community to look at not just replacing what's there, but how can we provide new experiences and amenities to serve the community, and how does that fit within that service area that it sits in and with the community. These concepts were also supported by council. So thank you again for your really thoughtful feedback in all these areas and taking the time with us. Staff's using this feedback again to continue to make progress on the plan, specifically in those areas of cost recovery framework and capital planning. We will be back before you in November with more of these details based on what we learned from you and what we continue to learn from the community. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much. You said you will be back in front of us and have more information. Is there a specific timeline, or is it just kind of in general within quarters of the next coming months?
We are planning to be before you again in November.
Very good. Council, any questions? Councilmember Coulter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick question, and I suspect I know the answer to this, but can I assume at November we'll get a little bit more detail around how cost considerations have changed given budget discussions and the financial challenges that we know we're going to be facing? Because I know that's what I've been hearing from a lot of folks is, given that new reality, what does this look like? So can I assume we'll get a little more information about that in November?
In terms of capital improvement planning?
Yes.
Yeah. I think we will be able to discuss that a little bit with you. It's, definitely a part of being able to implement park improvements. The master plan, I think, is, regardless of, a altered schedule to for implementation, really still going to provide that solid framework to create a balanced and equitable system, and how the financial support for implementation plays out is still uncertain, as you know, but I think we can touch on that with our update in November.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Council, additional questions? Seeing none, I know, Renee and Ann, I know that the Park Master Plan has got its own world in the City of Bloomington website, and I'm assuming that these latest developments, the summary of the council input on this and all of that information, if it's not already, it will be online soon for folks to have at their disposal and be able to read through and get a better idea of the directions that we're heading here.
Mayor Busey, members of council, we are in the process of setting up our Let's Talk page on the City of Bloomington's new community engagement platform. So we will be using that in addition to the page on the city website to include the summary of that, including the new summary we are just finishing of the Project Bloom engagement as well.
Very good. Thank you.
Mayor, members of the council, one other thing I would add too is, we feel like we're at about the 50% mark with the plan, and we do have some concepts that we will be running by you when we meet with you in November with the Park Commission and also the public. So yes, those will be appearing on our website as well.
Thank you much. Council, any additional questions? Seeing none, we'll say thank you to Ms. Clark and Ms. Catry for the update and appreciate it, and look forward to the presentation in November. Thank you so much.
Thank
you for your time this evening.
At this point, I'd like to acknowledge that Councilmember Nelson has joined us. I'm assuming you fought through your technical issues, Councilmember, and are with us once again, so welcome aboard. And I would like to move on to item number 2.2 on our agenda, which is a report on trees in the city. And Mr. Carl Keel, from our Public Works Director, is going to be presenting this. And I know we've got a number of other folks from our City Forestry and City Attorney's Office to talk to us about this as well. So I know this arose out of a number of questions that had come up over the past period of time, actually, about dead trees and the number of trees and how to deal with diseased trees and that kind of thing. So, Mr. Keel, good evening. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening, Mayor. Good evening, Council. I'm going to have a presentation on PowerPoint I'm going to attempt to share here. Let's see. You hold just a moment, and we'll get this up. All right. Are people able to see that?
Yes, we are. And you're coming through loud and clear. Please proceed.
Very good. Thank you. So I'm going to give a presentation today, but I'd also like to say that we have a couple other staff members that are on the line for questions. So from legal, we have our city attorney, Melissa Manderscheid, and Maureen O'Brien, our assistant city attorney, is also available for questions. And Dave Hansen, our city forester, is also joined us this evening. So as background, as we talk about this, I'd like to distinguish between public trees and private trees. So public trees are those trees that are located on city or government property or on right-of-ways on the street area in front of people's homes. And private trees are those that are located on individual property owners' property. Property owners are responsible for all aspects of private trees. And then on the public side, the city is. But we're focusing our conversation this evening on private trees. So would note that it's common that there are disputes often between neighbors regarding trees. They may be trees in one or the other's yards, or it may be a tree that is located right on the border between two properties. And for our discussion this evening, we've sort of split trees into four categories. Disease trees, which is really the only type of private tree that Bloomington is currently involved with or has a regulatory framework around. Hazardous trees, dead trees, and unsightly trees. And this evening, we're hoping to have a conversation with you. As the mayor indicated, there was some interest expressed in the past to try to increase the involvement of the city in trees, on private trees. And so we're asking you, should we explore ways to expand our involvement on private trees? And if so, to what degree? So I'll run through each of these types of trees. Disease trees, these are trees that are typically infested by some type of insect or pest. In Bloomington, we actually monitor three types of trees or regulate three types of disease: Dutch elm disease, oak wilt, and emerald ash borer. And would note that this is probably the most common city program for trees. Just about every city I'm aware of has a disease tree program. Currently, we provide kind of a wide range of services around the disease trees. We provide advice to folks if they call and have questions. We inspect private trees. Would note that about 75% of the trees that we inspect are, the inspection is initiated by city staff. They either, they have seen kind of indications, or there's a kind of an outbreak in a neighborhood. And so 75% of the trees are kind of initiated by the city, and probably about 25% are initiated by private property owners. We issue tags and enforce those tags for removal of trees. We actually even provide a contract that homeowners are able to use if they like. We have a contract that has set pricing for different types of trees in different situations. And if needed, we would assess the cost of that removal as well. From a legal point of view, state statute is pretty clear about city involvement in disease trees, and there's a number of different statutes that allow cities to have disease tree programs and to assess the cost of implementing those programs. And we have a number of existing ordinances that deal with that as well. On the hazardous tree side, these are trees that have some type of structural defect in them, and if they were to fail, they could cause some damage or injury. Now, the common definition of hazardous trees is that it has to have two criteria. One is that it has a structural defect or a hazard, and that it has a target, so that if it did fail, it would fall on something, a house, a shed, or a play area or something. So a tree that's out in the middle of the woods that may be hazardous, meaning that it has a defect, it's dead, or it has a crack or some type of other deficiency, but there wouldn't fall on anything of value below it, would not be considered a hazardous tree, at least by the common definition of a hazardous tree. Would also note that it's sometimes subjective or difficult to assess hazardous trees because oftentimes the defect may be internal to the tree. And so it often requires someone with a certain certification or education, an arborist, to make a determination of a hazardous tree. And with that, because if it's a hazardous tree and there could be damage, it could fall on a target, there are significant liability issues around hazardous trees. So oftentimes insurance companies are involved in the discussion of hazardous trees. Currently, we are not involved in an active way with hazardous trees, but we do provide advice to homeowners and would note that we're very careful not to give structural assessments because we are trying to avoid those liability issues associated with making that determination. We basically, if we think that there may be some concern, we would encourage homeowners to hire a private arborist to come take a look at their trees and give them more definitive direction. State law has less information about hazardous trees, but it does allow the statute 429 cities to assess the cost of the removal of hazardous trees. And if we wanted to pursue this in the city, we would have to develop new ordinances to do so.
Mr. Keel?
Yes.
Oh, I was just going to ask if are dead trees considered hazardous trees, or are they in their own category?
That's my next category here, are dead trees. So dead trees may or may not be hazardous trees or diseased trees. Does that answer your question, Mayor?
Yes, great. Thank you.
So a dead tree would be a hazardous tree if it had a target. But if it was in the middle of the woods or the middle of a backyard where there was no target underneath it, it wouldn't be technically considered a hazardous tree. Oftentimes, dead trees are kept for wildlife habitat, or in some cases, people find them to be kind of aesthetically pleasing. In city parks, for instance, in naturalized areas, we do not remove dead trees unless they are a hazard, that is, that they have a target under them. And we do that primarily because they provide pretty good wildlife habitat. Like hazardous trees, the city doesn't get involved actively with homeowners on private property, but we do provide advice. State law, again, doesn't have an awful lot of information regarding the city's involvement in dead trees, but we are allowed to assess costs for the removal of them if we would consider them hazardous. And like hazardous trees, we'd need new ordinances if we wanted to get into them, into managing them as a city. And the final category are unsightly or disfavored trees. And these are generally have some type of aesthetic objection. They may be, poorly trimmed, or they may be damaged from a storm. They could be what some people would refer to as weed trees, like cottonwoods or box elders. Or they may be the trees that are rather dirty, that sometimes people object to the helicopter seeds from maples. Cottonwoods, female cottonwood trees sometimes are quite messy. So these are ones that oftentimes people would like to see removed from the city. And again, it's a rather subjective assessment as to whether they are unsightly or disfavored. Now, some people, I know my brother lived in Utah for many years, and there people would advertise that their lots had cottonwood trees. They were a very desirable tree in Utah. And here people would never say they have a cottonwood tree on their property. People would rather see them, or oftentimes would rather see them removed. So it's quite subjective whether a tree is unsightly or disfavored. Again, we don't involve ourselves with those. We would give people advice if they ask. And there's not much authority granted in state law regarding unsightly or disfavored trees. And we would require new ordinances to get involved with them as well. So some other considerations just to keep in mind. Currently, we spend about $55,000 in staff time to manage our private disease tree program. This is to do the inspections and to kind of arrange for removal and to check on orders and everything involved with disease trees on private property. If we were to get into another category, one could get, while we don't have a real firm estimate at the moment about what we would expect, it could be on this same order of cost in addition to this to get involved in some other type of tree program. For an individual, trees can the cost to remove a tree can be vary widely, as little as $100, and we see oftentimes trees up in the range of $3,500 or more to remove. So a tree removal can be rather costly for some. If we did a quick survey of other cities, and that survey was kind of summarized in the memo. As I noted before, most cities have a disease tree program, where they are very much involved in the management of disease trees. There are a few that enforce and provide structural deficiency inspections for hazardous trees, but that's less common. There's not many that involve themselves with dead trees. and they frankly, many tried to kind of avoid getting involved in those. And I'm not aware, and we did not find any that involved themselves directly with unsightly or disfavored trees. From an equity point of view, would note that trees often help mitigate environmental impacts in the community, such as improving air quality and reducing heating and cooling costs. And there's been several studies that have found that BIPOC and other disadvantaged communities often have fewer trees, and so they're experiencing kind of a disproportionate impact of climate change and other impacts because of their reduced tree canopies in their communities. On the other hand, would note that the cost to remove trees can be quite expensive. And if we were to have a new program that potentially could burden homeowners with an additional cost, that may be a financial burden to some. And would also note that different ethnic communities have different aesthetic standards, and some may find certain types of trees to be an asset, and others might find them objectionable. And so I think there may be differing opinions between different communities within Bloomington. And with that, that's a quick summary of the memo. And again, we have guests available to answer more detailed aspects of legal or of forestry. We'd be happy to answer any questions or have a conversation. Again, we're looking for some direction from the council if they would like staff to develop more detailed proposals for increased involvement in trees, private trees in the city. And if you are, to what degree would you like us to explore those?
Thank you, Mr. Keel. Council questions? I see Councilmember Lohman and then Councilmember Beloga. Councilmember Lohman.
So thank you, Keel, both for the information that was in the packet and also kind of what you shared today. So just a quick kind of just a financial kind of question. So I saw $55K for the amount that would be charged to provide this particular service that we have ongoing right now. That's annual, I'm assuming, for that amount. Does that include the department fees that are charged, or is that a different amount above and beyond that?
That only includes the actual staff time involved with doing inspections and managing that program. I don't believe that cost includes overhead costs like legal or administrative or space and occupancy.
Okay, so that number might be a little bit higher if we're going to increase the amount of staff time. So if we were to increase that amount of staff time, would we see an increase in that number as well, in addition to that 55? If we were to say, let's go forward with this?
Yes, definitely would. And again, if you wanted us to go ahead with this, we would do a better analysis of what we think that extra cost would be, depending on what you'd like us to investigate. And I only shared that number to say, say we got into a damage program or a hazardous tree program, I think without doing a lot of analysis, I think it would certainly be on the same range of additional cost. 50,000 could be a little bit more to get involved in that.
And that 55, just so I'm understanding, and I think I read this in there, is mostly primarily staff time going out in the field, observing and making recommendations in terms of what's out there out in the field.
That's what the bulk of it is, yes. The other portion of that would be to manage that tree contract that we have. So if people would like us to help them remove a tree, we would put a work order into the contractor that we have on order, and then we would manage the cost of that. We'd have to bill them, make sure they paid, make sure the contractor performed properly, all those things. But the bulk of it is the inspection and writing of orders pieces of that.
Well, thank you. I know I've heard on many occasions that folks have had issues with this, with removing this among different demographics. So I do appreciate the different lenses by which that the report was prepared in the reading today. One other last question here, and I'll let you go. Are there other cities that are doing this? Is there a way to create a joint program, kind of like what we have with the health program? Has that been explored at all? we could work in a group in tandem, maybe Richfield or Edina possibly doing this type of work? Is there a way to kind of partner with that, help bring that cost down if we were to explore some of those other areas?
I'm not aware of any communities that are providing forestry services to each other. That may be an area where we might see some benefits of sharing costs, etc. Would note that many cities have their forestry programs vary. So Minneapolis, for instance, has a disease tree program, but it also has a very active reforestation program for the city and takes care of boulevard trees and all those types of things. So they have a more robust forestry program than we do. And I expect we have foresters and certified tree technicians on staff. And there are many communities that don't enjoy those type of capabilities. So perhaps there is an opportunity for that. I might ask Dave Hansen if he's aware of any sharing examples.
Carl, Mayor, Council. I am not. The cities that I reached out to were the larger ones and the ones that I have colleagues in. I'm not aware of anybody that's doing the sharing, but I'd be glad to connect with Richfield, Eden Prairie, and those folks next to us to see if there's an interest.
Councilmember Beloga.
Mr. Mayor, Carl, how many diseased trees are inspected and or removed from private lands annually?
I'll have to ask Dave Hansen that question. I'm sure he knows the answer.
I do. Councilmember Beloga. I'll just give you some numbers because I have them right up here. I was kind of prepared for this. So last year, or so far this year, we've marked about 150 private trees for removal. We still got a couple months. Last year it was in the 180 range, and then 150 the year before. It varies by the amount of disease we're observing. Back in the heyday of Dutch elm disease, there was a lot more of that. Now with EAB, we're out doing preemptive removals and marking on public property like boulevards and parks. And we're only going after the private trees once they become extremely obvious that they're infested with EAB. I do expect that to tick up in the next few years as EAB becomes more apparent on private property that where they haven't been dealt with. Does that answer your question?
It does, but it's far lower than what I had anticipated for the amount that we say we spend on it, because that means for each one of those 150 trees, our cost is about $375.
Yeah, the cost of salary and benefits that Carl's talking about includes all the public tree marking that we do too. So we do the same process on park trees and boulevards.
Okay, so we've got an apple and an orange here.
Okay.
The 55 includes all trees within the city that are inspected and or whether they be on private or public lands. Okay. Do we have a number on the private lands?
We don't separate those costs out. We don't track time differently. It's all under. We could do the ratio of. So, for instance, this year we've marked a total of 675 public trees. So that's boulevards and parks, and then we're at that about 150 private trees.
Okay.
So it's
that makes
small
it
percentage.
much different and more reasonable, more in line with what I expected it to be. So I suspect that you probably pitched in with Carl on the presentation materials. And I have a few questions on distinguishing between hazardous and dead trees. And the reason is that we know that a dead tree sooner or later is going to break and fall, right? I mean, they don't stand up forever.
Correct.
And
They're
so
going to
that,
decompose and
right, so that if it's near a residence, is that a hazardous, if it's going to fall on property, is a dead tree also a hazardous tree in our definition here?
well, I would go back to what Carl had said earlier, is that not all dead trees are hazards, but it needs to have that target around them. So like private property or the possibility of somebody walking by it would provide that target.
Yeah. So they get to be intertwined between hazardous and dead trees.
Absolutely.
Because all hazardous trees are not necessarily potentially a hazard, and same with all dead trees, right?
Right.
Okay. And I think what the public who has contacted me, and I get quite a number of complaints, and it's from somebody's dead tree falling across a property line onto a house, causing damage. And today, we don't have any means to be proactive to help with the removal of those trees. And so what I'd like to see council do is enact ordinances so that our city can look at hazardous and dead trees as respects to danger to either property or human life on private property. And if there are one of those conditions that exist, then under the proposed ordinance would be able to assist in the removal, and if necessary, to assess the cost of the removal. So that's what I'm looking for as a result of this discussion. Thanks for your time.
You're welcome.
Councilmember Nelson and then Councilmember Carter.
Thank you, Mayor. Let me just ask if you can actually hear me.
We can indeed hear you, yes.
Oh, excellent. My question is whether or not it's possible to differentiate a hazardous tree, the target on its own property, or a hazardous tree to target on a neighboring property. I think those are two concerns from when I've talked to people.
Mr. Hanson, Mr. Keel?
I believe that you could make a determination of that, and ask Dave to correct me if I'm wrong. It's really what you're saying is to distinguish between the target, be it if it's the homeowner's target, you would maybe not be as concerned about it, but if it's a neighboring property's target, you would. Is that correct?
That's exactly what I'm looking to do, because those are the issues that I see is where it's trying to get in between neighbors and what are our rules and how do we help get those to a successful resolution for everybody.
Mayor, if I may, I can jump in on this.
Ms. Manderscheid, please.
From a legal perspective, the difference would be that of a nuisance, in that it might be, if we drafted an ordinance related to this, it would seem like it would be more likely that it would be characterized as a public nuisance if the tree was to fall onto the neighbor's property, as compared to if the target was on one's own property. That would be a different characterization, in that there would be no public nuisance to that if it's not likely to fall onto another person's property, say, for example, due to the lot size or the location of the tree.
And that makes sense. That's a good distinction. It's a good distinction, Councilmember Nelson. Thank you for that. Councilmember Nelson, any additional questions? Very good. Let's move on. Councilmember Carter.
Thank you, Mayor. So I have a couple of just clarifying questions. So the question before us is, should we explore ways to expand our involvement in private kind of trees? And so are you asking if we would be willing to expand our involvement in hazardous, dead, and unsightly? Or are we talking specifically about the hazardous and the dead? I'm just curious. Or is that kind of open for discussion at this point?
I think that's the point of the discussion, to see where the council is interested in. In a way, they're in a hierarchy from disease trees to hazardous trees to dead trees to unsightly trees. And is the council willing to go down that hierarchy? And if so, how far?
Okay. So for hazardous trees, my understanding, based on what you said, is that our role is typically, we work with the homeowners, and then we typically encourage them to work with an arborist who will help them get the tree removed. We usually stay out of it because of liability issues. Did I hear you correctly?
That is correct, both for liability issue reasons, and we've not made the decision to move into those areas. So our ordinances aren't set up to allow us to do those currently.
So can you talk about the liability issues if we were to move into this space?
Again, so if there was a tree and we made a determination that it was not hazardous, or we looked at a tree and if someone said, I'm worried about this tree, and we came out and inspected it and we said, it looks pretty good, we don't need to do anything with that tree because it had the rot maybe inside, we didn't know where it was, and it fell, we would have some liability for having made a determination about the structural significance of the tree. Likewise, there may be a tree that's it's difficult to tell how it might fall or what the targets might be of that tree. Large trees can twist and move in lots of different directions. We may say, well, it's really not, it's damaged, but it may take some time before we think it would actually fall. And so we'd be making a determination that we'd be held liable for. So in arborists, I think, carry very large insurance policies because their work by its nature has a lot of uncertainty and liability associated with it.
So would this impact our own insurance policy in the city? Would we have to add or change or increase?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. We would have to, if you wish to kind of get into that, our next step would be to answer a few of those questions.
Thank you.
Council, additional questions? Well, to frame it up as Mr. Keel did, it's basically the four-step progression: diseased, hazardous, dead, or unsightly trees. Obviously, I think we want to stay in the business of diseased trees to manage the tree stock in the city and manage diseased trees like Dutch elm disease and the emerald ash borer. I'll jump all the way down to the bottom and then say unsightly trees, and I do think that's, a matter of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Sometimes, yes, there are unsightly trees, but I don't personally think we want to head down that route just because it becomes so subjective and so open to interpretation. So it brings us somewhere in the middle with the hazardous and dead trees. And I think Councilmember Beloga brought up a good point, and Councilmember Nelson brought up a good point as well, that I do think I would like to hear more about a proposal regarding a policy of some kind, an ordinance of some kind regarding a hazardous tree, but most specifically a hazardous tree to somebody else's property. If somebody has a dead or unsightly or a hazardous tree in the middle of their own yard, and if it falls, it's only basically going to fall in their yard or on their house, and they choose to keep that, I think that's one thing. But if it's on a property line or if it's poised over a neighbor's garage, I think it's an entirely different issue, and would be something that I would be interested in exploring, I think, for what the cost would be, what the scope of the program would be, if there are other examples that we could borrow from other cities in terms of how it's set up and what their program looks like and what their liability has been over the years and what their issues have been in terms of insurance and costs and so on, and just get a look at that, and we could have that. We could continue this discussion. But personally, I think it's worth at least looking at, because I've also heard from some homeowners about this. Not a huge number, but enough that it comes up at least periodically in my inbox or in my phone, and frankly, just seeing it as you cross the city and look through the neighborhoods, being out and about, you can see, you can identify that would be an issue if it was my neighbor's tree over my garage or over my driveway like that, I'd have an issue, and I would like somebody to think about that. So that's my thought, that it would be a worthwhile discussion to continue without committing one way or another that we're absolutely going to go down the road that we may, but I think it's worth to continue that discussion. Council, thoughts on that?
Mr. Mayor, this is
Councilmember Beloga.
thank you, and I agree with your assessment, and I think that's the next logical step. So I think that would be including the comments that Councilmember Nelson added to my earlier comments too. So this is really protection for homes that are adjacent to, not the individual homeowner, because they have total control over that. If you're the neighbor to somebody who has a hazardous or dead tree that threatens your property, today your hands are tied in what can be done other than to wait for the event. So,
Councilmember Carter, did you want to weigh in?
You just add that I'm supportive moving forward with a proposal around the hazardous and dead specifically.
So, Council, if we can get one more nodding head or thumbs up, I think we can direct staff to perhaps move forward on this evaluation. I see it from Councilmember Coulter, and I would like to, I would like to do that. If we could just move forward and continue to consider this, and again, without making a commitment one way or another, just say that we want to learn more about what a program like this would look like, what the cost would be, what the parameters would be, and what the overall impact would be, and to report back, and we can continue this discussion and make a decision then. Fair enough?
Very good. Thank you, Mayor and Council. That's good direction. We can work with that.
Very good. Council, anything else on that? If not, we're going to move on to item 2.3, which is our Community Budget Advisory Committee update and a budget packages recommendations. And we have with us this evening in the council chambers our two co-chairs of the Community Budget Advisory Committee, Mr. Steve Peterson and Mr. Neil Peterson, not related. And they have been working diligently. They and their community have been working, our committee have been working diligently since July. We greatly appreciate your work and your leadership on this, gentlemen. Thank you so very much. And know that you and your committee and the staff have put in a lot of hours on this. And I know it's been a challenge in some cases. I know it's been informative. I know there's been some good back and forth. I've been watching and listening to the debate, and am interested to hear what you're going to bring forward and the recommendations you're going to be making to the council. So good evening and welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Again, Steve Peterson here, and former Mayor Neil Peterson. We've met for, I don't know, what is it, Neil? Probably 40 hours at this point.
That's on the low side.
That's on the low side. Kind of walking through the kind of city's budget and the budget issue that we have, and we've come together on a preliminary set of budget scenarios that we want to talk about tonight. We'll be also talking to the community about these later this week, and then coming back with the final set of recommendations at the beginning of November. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. So this is the agenda. We'll have a little bit of background. We'll talk about the information sources that the committee has been using, the process we've been going through. Then we'll kind of dive into the scenarios that we have, and then we have some next steps. And if you look at the top of this slide for folks who are watching, if you have feedback, you can go to the committee's website. That URL will show up on each of these pages, and share your feedback on the on what we're up to. So if you could move to the next slide, just a quick recap on this, because we presented on this before and kind of had quite a bit of conversation about it. But basically, the big issue in the city budget is lodging and admissions taxes being down due to the pandemic. And if you look at the slide, you can see how we've gone from collecting about $10 million in taxes in 2019. That's going to be down next year by about $5 million. It was down about $6 million this year. And that's really there's some other minor things, but that's really at the crux of the issue that the committee is after. So if you move on to the next slide, for folks who might be getting introduced to this topic for the first time, again, you can go to the committee website. And, as Neil mentioned, there's those 40 hours of recorded meetings. You can watch our meetings and learn all of the detailed information on that. We've also got a bunch of budget documents, information from the staff, service assessments, and a bunch of other information that we used as an input to the process that we went through. So now I'll move on and we'll talk about the preliminary recommendations. So if you can advance the slide one more. These are the information sources that we ended up using, and we've really tried to run a really inclusive process. The committee itself is all volunteers, but it's not just the committee. We've had a lot of conversations with folks in the community, both in formal listening sessions in a variety of venues, but I know that committee members have also been getting phone calls, we've been getting emails. We've had input from the staff, and then we have several committee members that have unique knowledge of the city that they've been able to bring to bear. And all that information has been brought into the process that we're doing. So if we talk a little bit about the process on the next slide here that we've been going through, there's really three things that we have, steps that we've been going through in terms of kind of building these budget scenarios. The first one, as part of kind of the initial conversations that we had, is we did identify a couple of capital project savings. And if you look in those boxes on the left, we decided that we would recommend next year skipping savings toward the pool replacement. I believe that's 2026 is the year that is scheduled for, and say basically that instead of saving for that, we would finance that at that point in time. And then similarly, reducing the abatement for the Normandale Lake District. In kind of sharpening the pencils, we were able to find that the money that was getting set aside there, we don't really need to set aside as much for that. So that also kind of took $650,000 out. So those two numbers are built in to the kind of basic budget scenarios that we have. You won't see those listed because they're hidden away inside the particular kind of budget totals that we ended up having. So then we ended up having quite a bit of conversation about what sort of revenue scenarios that we wanted to have. And there's basically two major variables that we ended up looking at and talking about there. Number one is what assumptions do we make about property taxes for next year? And there's three scenarios that we ended up going with: a 5% increase in property taxes, 3%, and a 0% increase. The other area that we focused on was on revenue forecast for the hospitality industry. And the committee, when we ended up getting three proposals from the staff, or three kind of scenarios from the staff on that. There was a optimistic scenario, there was kind of a middle of the road scenario, and there was a pessimistic scenario. And Neil, it must have been that our committee was filled with pessimists, because we all said we're going to take that pessimistic scenario, and that's the one we're going to do. Well, if we look at what's happened since this summer in the hospitality industry, particularly what's happened is we really haven't seen a big resurgence in business travel, and travel that was related to families going out. Necessarily, school has started back up, and a lot of families aren't traveling. So the hospitality industry forecast has tracked much more closely to that pessimistic scenario, and that is the one that we selected, and it's turned out to have been the right decision to do that. So that combination of two things is really what we used on the income side to determine what we were going to plan on for there. And then the final set of work, and this is what we're talking about tonight, is the budget reductions. And so if you look at the table on the right that has the three property tax scenarios of 5%, 3%, and 0%, you'll see that those are dollar amounts for budget reductions that are needed to achieve each of those. So if you select the 5% options, we need budget reductions of about $1.5 million. 3% gets you need 2.8. And then 0% gets you to nearly $5 million in budget reductions that would be required. So we're going to test out your eyesight and move on to the next slide here. Because this slide, and we're going to dive into this in a little bit more detail, but this slide at a summary level shows you the different scenarios that we're working with here. So over on the left there, you can see the original budget. And just something to point out here is if you look at the police department and the public works area and parks and recreation in the city, or actually really police and public works, that gets you to a pretty decent sized chunk of the total city budget. So it's important as we talk about each of these things that people kind of keep in mind those particular budget numbers. So I'm going to walk you through kind of how this chart works a little bit, and then we'll go and focus in a little bit on each of the scenarios and talk about them. So in that section that with the three columns that's headed by the 5% levy, the reduction column is the dollar amount of the reductions that we have in that department for that 5% scenario. So a good example is if you go under reduction and you follow the admin row across under 5% levy, you'll see that we're proposing a $348,000 reduction in the spending in that particular area. If you then go to the next column where it says percent of reductions, that $348,000, that represents about 22% of the total set of reductions for that particular, at the 5% levy. And then the third column indicates what's the budget reduction in terms of the percent of the budget for that area that's being reduced. And in this particular case, the $2.7 million budget, that number you see over there on the left, is being reduced by 12.9%. So that same pattern is repeated across for the 3% and for the 0% levy. The only difference is in the 3% and the 0%, we show both the incremental reduction, which is that reduction column, and then we add that to the previous one to get the total reduction at the 3% level. And so a good example here is that we'll follow the community development line across. At the 5% level, that department's budget was reduced by $144.7 thousand. In the 3% levy, it gets reduced an additional $298,000 for a total of $443,000. So that's what that's intended to represent, both the kind of amount it got reduced incrementally and then the total that it's reduced if you're at the 3% level. So with that introduction, we'll kind of move on to the next page where things get a little bit bigger and we talk about the actual set of changes that we're doing here. So I had sent in the email to the council links to 2 supporting documents that are posted on that CBAC website. That, again, that's the URL that's in the upper right-hand corner of the slide for those who are following along at home. One of those slides has a super detailed list of the precise set of changes to the budget that we're recommending at each level. The other PDF document has almost 100 pages where each of the changes is described on a single page in that document. And so necessarily to fit this all on one slide, this is summarized at a summary level for people who are interested in kind of drilling into that next level of information. We have all of that posted on the web for folks to look at. So the key thing that I want to point out here is how things kind of fell at the 5% scenario. And if we look at the percentage of reductions at the 5% scenario, really administration, Park and Recs, and to a lesser extent Public Works are the 3 departments that receive the bulk of the reductions at this level. For the administration area, the primary driver on that is the closure of the motor vehicle office, which is accounted for in that bucket. And in the Parks and Recreation area, you can see that in the list of items on the right there are a bunch of things that impact services that are delivered by the Park and Recreation Department. There are also fee increases too, and this reflects both those fee increases and the reduced services there. And then finally, we see reductions in the Public Works Department reflected in here as well. So if we can advance it to the 3% scenario, at this particular area level, the reductions here tend to start falling a little bit more heavily on Parks and Rec and Public Works and Community Development in this particular area. And Community Development in particular, leaving the Community Development Director job unfilled. There's a couple different positions there that would be left unfilled. And I can't remember, is the traffic calming paid for out of Community Development or is that out of Public Works? I can't remember. Public Works? I'm seeing a nod to Public Works. Moving on to the 0% scenario, you can see the kind of values of the committee because this is really where the kind of what I call the core services of the city, the public safety related activities of the city start to end up getting hit here. And if you look here at the 0% levy, we have almost $1 million in reduction in the police department totaling at this particular area. Which is about 20% of the total set of reductions. And that's because at this level, really, we had to start making some really difficult decisions. And if you look over on the right there, there's quite a few kind of public safety related expenses that we would be talking about not having for 2021 if this particular level was adopted. So that's at a high level, kind of a walkthrough of the scenarios. I'm going to stop at this point and see if folks have questions for us regarding the three scenarios we had there.
Council, any questions? And Ms. Wilson, you might have to help me here as we're got a different slide up or a different look here.
I can't see them either, so I'm going to exit the screen.
Okay.
Some of them, yep. Councilmember Lohman.
So I'll go ahead and get a couple questions off here. So a question about the supporting documentation. I saw a list that had two numbers on it that's posted out there. He didn't show it here, but how am I supposed to understand what those number rankings are on that sheet? There wasn't really any instruction to that.
Yeah, so the key thing when you're looking at that spreadsheet is you look way over on the right, and there's a color-coded section there that shows which scenario that ended up getting assigned to. So if you look at that sheet, and if you look all the way to the right, you'll start out by seeing all of the detailed items that were in the 5% scenario are the ones that show up in that area, in that section there. And if you look at the rank column, that's the committee's rank value that we assigned that particular either fee increase or kind of service reduction.
And the rank is, so if it's in the so if the rank is number one, that's the one that we're cutting?
Yeah, so like a good example, if you look at that, you'll see that there, right at the top of that spreadsheet, you'll see that there's a bunch of things that are related to travel on there. And given the situation with the travel industry and those sorts of things, the committee agreed as a group that we're going to take all of the travel items and just push them right to the top and say those were the first things that we were going to cut on there. So that's what that's representing, is kind of, those were the things that we felt like were most, that had the least amount of impact to go and cut. And so that's what those are on the top of the list, and it just basically follows that order all the way through.
So I haven't had a chance to follow all of what you guys have done. So I know that when originally this came before when we made the charge for the subcommittee, one of the things that I know that I mentioned is about this issue of looking at these things through a lens of equity. Can you help me understand, and just for the general public, how we look through those lenses? We looked at this particular list. How was that kind of accounted for? Or maybe it wasn't accounted for when we look through this list and the list that we see in the budget that we have today.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of ways that we address that particular question. One is we had very targeted feedback sessions that were oriented toward groups that might otherwise not be as well represented in the city's budget process. And so we had in particular, we had a BIPOC community and a Latina community session where we gathered specific feedback. The other thing that we did receive as a committee was an assessment from the racial equity coordinator at the city of her assessment of the racial equity impacts of each of the, not of every item on there, but she called out particular items on the list that had kind of particular racial equity impacts. And so we had quite a bit of discussion at the committee level about kind of that feedback. And as people ranked things, they incorporated that input into their ranking process that they went through.
So the committee members that were there took both from the racial equity coordinator we had and from those that feedback session with the different BIPOC groups, and they used that as a guide to look at this list.
Yeah, and so just to be clear, Councilmember Lohman, we did not take the specific feedback and compare it to the list in terms of as we were ranking things. What we did is we educated the committee members on here's where that impact ends up landing, and it was one of all of the different factors that the committee members considered when they were ranking particular items.
I just was curious about that process. I wasn't clear about that. I also wanted to make sure that the viewing public was understanding in terms of what that process looked like, how it operated, and looked at for the process.
Yeah, and that was, and just one more thing, if I can, Councilmember Lohman. You know, it was interesting to hear that feedback because we heard, obviously, we really worked hard to get that feedback. But what I thought was interesting about it is that we heard both feedback about kind of the social services part of what the council and the city does, But we also heard people's concerns just kind of about basic kind of public safety services. And as you can see in here, the kind of public safety services are a big part of the budget. And so, if it's not like that feedback all weighed on some particular set of items. I think we heard, in many places in the budget that people cared about that particular area. So.
One last piece. So you talked a little bit about that process. Just for the public's benefit, how did this list get to it? Did each individual person on the committee rank it up and down, and then we put it together, or how did we get to this particular list that we have before us today with the three different budget proposals of what we're going to cut?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So one of the things that the committee has tried really hard to do has been to try to operate by consensus. So we're not a big group for having votes on things. We're about discussing things and see if we can identify common ground on stuff. The way the actual ranking process worked is we, on 2 consecutive weeks, we did kind of dot ranking exercises where each committee member had the same number of red dots, yellow dots, and green dots. Red dots mean I don't think we should be cutting that. Green said I'm okay with that. So like travel got a lot of green. If you look way down on that list in the spreadsheet, those would be things that got lots of red. And so we did kind of a dry run one week just to see how things kind of came out and kind of get people familiar with the idea of doing the ranking and how people were feeling about it. And then the next week we did that same exercise again and used that in order to set weights for things. And then we took the result of that and we had the staff look at it and see if there were any obvious areas where like we should be combining things together or taking things apart. And we did some adjusting. So an example in there, you can see like that travel adjustment is one of the adjustments that we did to kind of bring that up. Then we had a conversation, and originally we were intending to go through and do a bunch of tweaking of the order of things. But as a group, we decided that what we had there was close enough to go out and talk to the public about it and get feedback. And so that's the state that it's in right now. But basically it represents everybody, the kind of combined weight of everyone's input on the relative prioritization. And that's how we got to that.
Thanks for clarifying that. I see another council member wants to ask more questions. I can hold off any other questions I have till later on the first day.
Thank you, Councilmember Lohman. Councilmember Carter.
Thank you, Mayor. So first, thank you so much. I've watched several of the budget advisory meetings, and I really like the robust conversation, and I really, really love the process that you kind of had the committee go through in terms of prioritizing these really difficult decisions. So I know that there was a lot of discussion related to the Parks and Rec budget items and possible scenarios with Three Rivers Park District. And I'm wondering how that kind of those conversations play into these kind of scenarios and the items that are in each of the scenarios related to Parks and Rec.
Okay, thank you for the question. One of the things that you'll notice if you go look at the spreadsheet that's posted on our website is there's a bunch of things like the Three Rivers Park District kind of collaboration that are ranked very low on that. And that's a very intentional decision. The committee really felt strongly that we would only pick ideas that had kind of a concrete path to being implemented for the budget for next year. And so we very deliberately took out anything that that the city effectively didn't have the power to do unilaterally. And the relationship with the Park District is one example of that, is that we don't have a deal that's struck with the Park District around that. And so that was not included. I will mention here at this point that the committee does have a parking lot of ideas that we feel that the city council should consider looking at for perhaps fiscal 22, but that aren't achievable for fiscal 21 that we'll transmit with our final report at the beginning of November. But any kind of arrangement that requires negotiation with another party and coming to some sort of consensus, we ended up striking out. Other examples of that were things that required negotiation with employee groups, with unions, things that required sales of land, were other things that we talked about and we decided to put in that parking lot and not include. I don't know, Neil, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think that, and the committee was very strong, knowing that there had to be cuts There's no choice. There has to be cuts. And we wanted to protect fire and life safety. And I was one of those that talked about it. I pay taxes. I want you to have police, and I want you to have fire protection, and I want you to plow my streets. And so those areas, for some of us, were very, very important. And I think this 5% increase does reflect that those areas were protected. And even in the community outreach meetings we've had, it comes up very strong that they want fire protection and they want police protection. That's a very, very high basic need. And so some of the other things that we'll deliver are more philosophical in approach, but they won't get us to the goalpost in these next few weeks because the decision has to be made.
Great, thank you. I'm sure I'll have more questions, but I will let you guys get through your presentation. So thank you.
Well, there's really no more presentation. It's just the wrap-up slide is the only one. So if you've got questions, this is really the time.
Thank you, Councilmember Carter. We can certainly come back. We've got all night to work on this, right? Councilmember Beloga.
Thank you. Steve, let me add to both of you, and please pass it on to the others who aren't present. But we do thank all of you for your diligence and time in putting this information together. One of the things that I'm surprised is absent from the recommendations is relative to doing tasks, but a lesser amount. So I think we've got 9 miles of streets in 2021 targeted for repaving. And that's a significant cost, and it's one that's totally absorbed by the city. And I expected to see a lesser, a recommendation to do a lesser amount, because as we know, to a great extent, there's a degree of subjectivity to all that. And yet it maintains continuing to fix the streets that need it the most, yet creates savings and in all scenarios continues to provide other needed and desired services. So can you talk about the absence of that and how I don't see that on here at all. I see some other things that you have as zero. So just take me through what the discussion was, if you would.
Yeah, so and I think this is an example of why we're out talking about this as a preliminary plan, because I think that's a really good catch that we should go and have a look at. And I think what we'll do is we'll ask the staff to come back and talk about that particular item. But we did use a list of items that was generated by the staff, that included items that we received from the public and that were generated by the committee. And so part of the reason why we're out with this preliminary set of things, and to be honest, I think part of the reason why we didn't invest too much in tweaking it to within an inch of its life is that we fully expected to get some additional ideas as we went along, and we wanted to collect those up and be able to include them in the process and not have this seem like too much of a finished product.
And capital budgets. We just didn't go there.
Yeah. And so the other question would be kind of from a capital budget accounting perspective, we didn't have capital budgets in the scope. And so, I think we want to look at the street project in particular and see if that's something that would cause cash savings in 22.
Good. And I couldn't help but notice that in all of the travel, I see many areas of the city, but not the administration being reduced.
Mm-hmm.
So can you share with me why administration travel? It just seems to be sending the wrong message, that if we're asking all to do it, it's all or none.
Mm-hmm. And I think, each of the travel items came forward as separate proposals from each of the departments. So I think we could certainly go back and have a look at admin to see what the costs were in that area. It's possible that there wasn't enough there that they felt it was worth coming forward, or it may be something that we want to consider. So that's another good point to bring forward.
Good, thanks.
Okay.
Council, additional questions? I think you bring up a good point with the fact that you were tasked with looking at the general fund and the general fund expenditures, and we didn't. Yep. We specifically, I think, left out any of our other funds. We left out the capital funds and a variety of other things. We asked you specifically to concentrate on the general fund.
Right, and it was anything that received kind of levy support or levy or support from the those particular forms of revenues were the ones that were in scope for the conversation. So there were some of the internal service funds that were also things that we ended up talking about as well. So it's not just the general fund, but the problem that we're having here is related to kind of tax revenues that go pay for general activities of the city. So things that were out of scope. A good example is the kind of water-related utilities that the city operates, the wastewater, the freshwater, and the stormwater funds. Those are paid almost exclusively through user fees. And so because those are user fee supported, there really wasn't any opportunity to help with kind of the general fund revenue problem in those particular funds. And so we did focus in on things where it would have an impact that were impacted by the pandemic and the areas that we were trying to fix.
And because I know the question will come up, or it probably has come up, you also did not look at the South Loop Development Fund.
That's right. That's right.
Because that fund...
We did talk about it.
Yeah.
You did talk about it.
We talked a lot about it.
Yeah. But it wasn't because of the statutory restrictions on it. It couldn't be brought into scope for the conversation. I think that's one of the items that's on our list to bring forward for looking at next year.
I was in the room when it happened, if I can take a phrase out of Hamilton, with the opening of the mall and the approval. I was the only person that voted no on the mall, and I ended up doing the grand opening, and then helped administer that for many years. But I have great disdain for the size of that budget that sits over there. We have this terrible problem right now and having to cut the budget and let there's $80 million sitting in a war chest. And I fail to understand it. Maybe it's my age and stage, and maybe it's my feeling guilty because I helped initiate that. But that needs to be looked at. And you need to come to grips with how you're going to handle that going into the future. But that doesn't deal with the problem we have now. We had to come up with $1.5 million immediately and do it in a way that we can maintain some livability in this community. It's going to be rougher next year. But it also assumes that you're willing to go ahead with a 5% levy increase. It's a unique time. If Hennepin County continues to do, I think, a 0 budget increase, school board is looking at 2%. Bloomington could go ahead and do a 5% levy increase, and most taxes on our average house will not go up. It'll cost about $40 a year, $5 a month. And for that, we keep our police, we keep our fire, we keep the operations in this city that are so important to us. That's your decision to make. But that's where the committee, you start going into the 3% or the 0, the cuts are devastating to the livability of this community. And I'm saying that as a taxpayer who's been in this community for over 40 years and played a principal part in a lot of the leadership. So all we can do is make a recommendation. The final decision will be yours, and it's going to be a tough one. And you can't spend a lot of time the next few weeks talking about the little fine points. Now we have to get on with it.
Agreed. I think as we greeted each other in the hall on the way in, we basically said it's mid-October. We have to get on with this. We have work to do, and we've got to get to a decision fairly quickly here. And I appreciate your input, appreciate your perspective that you do bring, and one of the important reasons why you're a member of this committee, to bring a perspective like that, to bring that long-term perspective, and to to offer your input and your insights that, frankly, are very valuable. I appreciate it.
And if I could just comment, I have really appreciated Steve's leadership in this. It just could not have happened without his approach and his technical qualities. But at the same token, your staff spent every hour with us that we were here grumbling about the 40 or 50 hours that we spent. But your staff was here too. They did not lead us, but they were a resource. And so very impressive. And they had to explain to their families why they were gone so much too. So
absolutely.
I hope this is a report that you can use. We certainly hope that you understand it's with a great deal of humility and a great deal of concern that we bring it to you. The next step will be yours once we've finished.
Absolutely. And we're this is still a process. We're still underway here, still with work to do. And it's not a finished product right now. I know there continues to be revisions. There continues to be questions and answers and a continued look at things. And
if Mr. Mayor, we could put up that last slide, then I can actually close it out here because that talks about kind of the remaining steps of the committee. So this week, on Thursday and Saturday, we have community input sessions scheduled. Last I heard for the Thursday one, we had 40-some people signed up for that, probably higher at this point. Saturday morning people don't want to come and talk about city budget on Saturday morning, fewer people in that. We also have the Let's Talk Bloomington kind of community input site. There's a link to that on there. And then the final meetings of our committee, kind of a week from Wednesday, and then 2 weeks from Wednesday is when we'll be taking that input from the community input sessions and making final changes to these scenarios in order to produce the report that we'll bring back to the City Council in early November. So that's really the arc of the committee. Again, if you look at the upper right-hand corner, you can go to that webpage and give us feedback on what you've seen tonight or read more about what the committee is up to.
Very good. Council, any additional questions, comments? Councilmember Lohman?
Yeah, just one question. I just saw the word survey there, and it just occurred to me that I can't remember in the looking over of items. I know we had some surveys on a couple of services that we had over this year. Did any of that get pulled into that conversation at all during the meetings? I know the ones I watched, you didn't talk about that. But did that become a part of the conversation at all? Our annual surveys or any other surveys we've done? I think we did one on on the community center or something like that.
Yeah, so I think the annual survey, Councilmember Lohman, is one that we did discuss in the committee. If you go to the website, actually all of the items that we considered are posted on the site. So it really is something where if you watched all the meetings and read everything on there, you'd probably spend 60 or 70 hours going through it. But we did get both the service assessments that the city has been doing on some of the major services in the city and the kind of annual survey that goes out to residents that collects data about kind of what they like about city services and what they'd like to see improved. So we did consider that as part of the input.
But you didn't consider the survey for that we did about the, I think there's one on the community center, and I'm trying to think what the other service was. Maybe it was a motor vehicle, I think it was, if I'm remembering correct.
So, Jamie, I'm not remembering if we considered those specifically in the
Mr. Mayor, council members, and co-chairs. We did not specifically review the results of the survey with them. We referenced that we had done them, and I believe it's in the documents that are posted on the website as a reference for the committee members, but I'll go back and check to make sure.
Okay.
I'd just be curious what the committee, if they have not reviewed it, what they thought of that. Just one council member's interest.
Okay, and if we'll go back and look, and if it hasn't been brought to the attention of the committee already, we'll be sure to bring it to their attention.
If I can make one more point, Mr. Mayor and co-chairs, regarding surveys, we're expecting that the results of our annual community survey will be provided to us relatively soon, and the committee will hopefully have that as an input into their final decision-making process before they make the recommendations to the council as well.
Great, that will be helpful as well. Councilmember Beloga?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I see that one of the items that we have is the closure of motor vehicle office. And that seems to be the spending to support that. And there is revenue that offsets that. So I'm a little confused as to how you are working this. Can you explain that
Sure.
to me?
Sure. So the reduction that we show in the detailed spreadsheet that's on the website around the motor vehicle office is the amount that's saved from that would be paid for out of the property tax levy. So it's net of any revenues that we end up getting. So the budget for that office is substantially above the savings that we're showing in the spreadsheet.
Okay, and I guess I'm just behind on that because I think the last time we talked about it as a council in depth, it was between $50,000 and $100,000 of subsidy, is what my memory serves at least, and so the 2.25 sort of blows me away.
So we originally, when that came in, we had a similar number, but when the staff went back and looked at the internal service charges related to that operation, that's, if I remember right, that's where that gap ended up is from that number, Councilmember Beloga, that you were talking about, is related to kind of internal service charges and how those are recovered.
Well, that confuses me more because it says not including internal service charges.
Yeah, I think if you're looking at the detailed sheet, that was the one that went out the first week, and after when the staff went and gathered the additional data, the internal service charges were netted off of that. So if that's still in the spreadsheet, it's because we didn't update that.
Well, this is the one you sent a link to last night.
Right. And the titles of those were taken off of the initial week data. We got that data halfway through the process, and the title probably was not updated.
Okay, so I'll get from staff then some additional information. Yeah. And lastly, can you forward to us the information that you presented that's not included in the package for tonight's meeting?
So specifically, are you talking about the spreadsheet that we're talking about?
The slide deck that you showed.
That should be attached to the email that I sent to the council yesterday. So
I did not.
Okay, we can make sure you have a copy. If
I
you don't have
may
it.
have gone through your email too quickly. And
Okay.
So I'll look again.
Okay. Yeah, if you don't have it, let me know and I'll send you another copy.
I find it is there, Steve.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah, I saw it sometime this morning and just haven't had time to really thoroughly go through.
Okay.
Council, last call for questions or comments? If we could we put up the last slide of the presentation once again, just as a reminder to everybody who might be watching? Of the next steps here, we have community input sessions Thursday evening, Saturday morning, and the input will be taken on all of the information that has been presented tonight, as well as all the information that's on the website. And again, as Mr. Peterson has pointed out, upper right-hand corner of this slide shows the web address of all of the information that the Community Budget Advisory Committee has both gathered and put together as well. So please, as you head into those community input sessions, take just a few minutes to look through some of that information and be prepared to discuss what you see there and what is actually being discussed. There's a community survey at Let's Talk, and then the final committee meetings are coming up on the 21st and 28th of October, and then the CBAC will be reporting to the City Council in early November based on all of the input they've received, based on the information that they've put together, a variety of sources, and that is what the presentation, that is what we will be getting in early November from our Community Budget Advisory Committee. Gentlemen, anything else to add on this?
I don't think so.
No, think so.
Once again, thank you so very much for the work that you've done. Thank you. Please pass our thanks on to your committee as well. Outstanding work thus far. You've given us a lot to think about, and the community a lot to think about. And it is going to be a robust and effective discussion, I think, as we head toward our decision in November regarding what the future budget is going to look like for the city of Bloomington.
Okay, well, thank you and the council for the time tonight, and we will see you next month.
Very good. Thank you. With that, council, we will move on to item 2.4, which is our utility fund budgets. And trying to get there, and I believe that is going to be Kari Carlson, our budget manager, is going to be presenting this to us. Good evening, Ms. Carlson. Welcome.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. This evening, we are going to be presenting the proposed 2021 budgets and rates for the 4 utility funds. These are the 4 utility funds: water, wastewater, stormwater, and solid waste. These are all enterprise funds, which means they are business type funds that provide services to the public and are predominantly supported by fees. So this evening, also at the meeting tonight, Utility Superintendent Scott Anderson is on, and he will be presenting the water and wastewater funds. And then Water Resources Manager Brian Griedel will be presenting stormwater. And Project Coordinator Laura Horner will be presenting solid waste. And now I will turn it over to Scott Anderson, and he will be going through the information for the water and wastewater funds.
Thank you, Kari. Good evening, Mayor, OC Council members.
Good evening, Scott. Welcome.
Thank you. We'll go over kind of some high-level brief introduction, and then we'll talk about kind of the process or the thinking behind what we have presented for you tonight. First, as council is aware, the Water Utility Fund accounts for the costs related to the operation, maintenance, and ultimate renewal of the city's water production and distribution facilities. The city has strived for a long time to provide an uninterrupted supply of drinking water, which meets or exceeds all federal and state quality standards at an affordable rate that ensures long-term sustainability of the infrastructure. This fund, ultimately, I think, as we've talked in the past, is driven by 2 things: consumption or demand, which in the past we've talked a lot about weather and climate impacts to ultimate water demand, and in 2020 we saw something else that impacts demand as well, in terms of the things related to the COVID pandemic. And then secondly, the need to not only operate and maintain that system day to day, but planning for the ultimate renewal and replacement. Next slide, please. So first, I'll talk a little bit about demand for 2020. So the blue line, this is our kind of week-to-week water use for 2020, and the red line is an average, or a recent average, 2013 through 2019. And we've kind of chosen that average because that's kind of become our reality of late, I guess, for the last 5 or 6 years. And stretching back a little bit, even beyond that, since about 2012, we've been in a fairly sustained wet pattern where we've had above normal or above average precipitation. Most of those years significantly impacting summer use and ultimately impacting revenue. So we've tried to, each subsequent year, try to predict revenue and base our activities on those not as favorable conditions. And so that's why we compare to that recent average. And as you can see, 2020 hasn't performed as we'd like. It's been below average in terms of water production and demand. And then I'd also note, speaking specifically of 2020, the March and April timeframes where you can, that's prior to outdoor irrigation or outdoor water uses, and you can see a significant drop off from the average there, presumably due to the hospitality industry and other business closures and reductions. Getting into May and June, things start to rebound and come close to resuming the curve, kind of the normal curve we're used to, albeit still not at those levels. Next slide, please. Another way to look at this distribution data, and I'll say distribution and demand and consumption, all generally relating to the same thing. We're comparing the gray line on the bottom is 2020 total distribution, and that includes Minneapolis purchases, to 2019, and the orange line right above. So again, if you're able to zoom in, you can see the departure in March and April, and this summer was a little better than last year. And again, 2019, just for reference, was the wettest rain year on record for us. So it's no surprise to see 2019 off of our average, and 2020 a little better, I'd say weather-wise, but obviously the impacts from the pandemic added its own second punch to that to hold us below our average. But with any luck, we'll at least catch up to 2019. Normally, we would expect to have an overall distribution close to 4 billion gallons. 2019, it was less than 3.5 billion, and again, 2020 is trending similarly, but a little bit below that. Next slide, please. So here we have, I guess, I'll talk a little bit about our rate structure and tiers. As you know, we have a conservation rate structure in place in Bloomington that's required by state statute, and that's what keeps us in compliance with statute and water supply planning. Tier 1 rate allows for up to 6,000 gallons a month or 12,000 gallons in a billing cycle. And Tier 2 kicks in after that. What these graphs are trying to show, on the left there, the average annual single-family residential use per month. So what's in blue is that Tier 1 use, red is Tier 2. And then to the right, you've got your average winter residential water use per month. Again, Tier 1 is in blue and Tier 2 is in red. And why I show these is to give council an idea, number one, of kind of the average residential use relative to those tiers. And remember, I said that that tier threshold is at 6,000 gallons a month on average. And so we've had kind of a continual declining trend in use going back to 13 and even before that. But more importantly would be the average use being typically, on average, well below that 6,000 gallon threshold. So the notion that most of our single family customers are able to certainly supply essential water and stay well within Tier 1. And in fact, when you look at the average annual on a monthly basis, most of that use is still below 6,000 gallons a month. So in theory, you've got some room there to do your irrigation and other outdoor uses and still remain in Tier 2. And I'll get into a little more detail in a couple slides as well, or after this. Next slide, please. So here's just a little more detail on that. And again, the two slides on the left are what you just saw, and the graph on the right is that average annual single family residential water use per month. And so you can see that that Tier 2 consumption is really hitting in the winter. There's some in the winter too, but it's that summer use that's the tier 2 driver. And I'll talk also, I guess, regarding this. We've had some discussions last year. We met and we began discussions on affordability with the council, specifically looking at tier 2 use among our residential customers. And you may not recall, but I'll just kind of just quick touch on that. On average, that tier 2 use, and I think at that time we were using 2018 data, was about $1.70 per month, and kind of I guess another data point, 65% of all single family customers and 80% of customers in lower valued homes. And if you remember, we had a little bit of a data issue in trying to find surrogates for income relating specifically to water use. But using those metrics, those two groups used less than 10,000 gallons a year of tier 2 water, or $26. So again, just that's the data point, and the significance of that can be, that's subjective, but that's what it is. And I guess from my perspective is it's tier 2 use by our single family residential customers is still pretty low compared to the tier 1 use. Next slide, please. We've also included in the past comparison of annual winter and summer water use and tier 2 use for our other customer classes, so commercial, multifamily, and single family. So single family residential in the dark blue, commercial in the light blue, and multifamily in the yellow. And again, just kind of getting a visual for the percentage of tier 2 use among those groups. And again, winter use extremely low, and summer where that summer use is what contributes to that annual tier 2 use. We have begun running numbers for 2020, and those distributions have not changed, even due to the stay-at-home with regard to increase of tier 2 use in residential properties, because our billing. Because our meter reads and our billing tend to lag, we didn't have those available. We obviously don't have a full year available for 2020, but we have started putting it together, and 2020 numbers match what you see here. Next slide. So this is a comparison of our 2020 water rate compared to our neighbors and other peer communities in the metro. This was after I think an 8.5% increase for 2020, and you can see we still compare quite favorably with our neighbors and peer cities. Next slide. So I think it was maybe at a study session right after we showed that slide, someone had said, that's a great comparison, but really what does that mean to our residents in terms of affordability and equity? And so that's when we started to look into that. The pandemic put a crimp into that work, primarily because one of the things we found is the data sets that we have to work with are on census tract or block levels, and it's really challenging to understand, on an account level basis, what's actually happening in a household in terms of income, family size, and things of that. So that's something we're still working on. We're now we're working with some outside groups and other agencies. Equity and water infrastructure, we've been having some discussions. I'm trying to understand what other communities are doing and how they're getting to some of these questions. What we have done to date is we've looked at kind of past affordability markers. EPA and American Waterworks Association had established an affordability definition of 2.5% of median household income as being affordable for water rates. But as you know, that's somewhat obtuse, and median household income doesn't mean much to a lot of people. So so given what we have, we've taken that and at least tried to understand, while that's not an adequate marker, we try to say, well, what is it for Bloomington anyways, just so we know. And so for 2020, Bloomington's water rate was 0.4% of median household income and 2.1% of poverty level income. Again, I don't believe that we're at a necessary conclusion point for council, but just something to be aware of as we continue to do this work. We're also beginning to look at some alternative metrics, some different ways to calculate affordability, where we're going to attempt to actually take into account other essential household expenses in addition to water rates and utilities, or look at water rates as a function of hours worked at a minimum wage job, for example. Other ways to try and understand affordability. So we're continuing down that path. Next slide. So this you've seen also before. This is the water utility asset outlook, or basically our asset renewal model. The blue line, and I apologize for the confusing nomenclature, it says forecast. So what that is, that's the forecast that our original age-based only model looks at. So if certain water infrastructure has an expected life of 75 years, if we put it in 74 years ago, then next year it's coming up for replacement, and there's the cost to do that. So that's what the blue line is. The orange line is what I refer to as actual. This is what we think replacement will look like after we incorporate the other asset management criteria into the decision in terms of reliability, risk, condition, and opportunity in terms of collaborating with pavement management project, and things, or another, a county project or a state project, things like that. This is, well, next slide. So I guess, and then additionally, as we put together the recommendations for tonight, both water utility and wastewater utility, we try to, even though we make these presentations typically later than the levy and the general fund and the other budgets, we worked side by side with Carl and the rest of Public Works in terms of trying to identify adjustments and cuts to our expenditures in 21, mirroring what Public Works was proposing to the Citizens Budget Advisory Committee. So things like eliminating travel, some reductions in professional services that relate to some future projects, reduce materials for potential reduction in water production, as well as delaying some capital project. And those particular delays aren't what I'd call significant delays. They're 1 to 3 to 5 years down the road. And when you're talking about a large project like rehabilitation of the Northwest Water Tower, for example, 1 year here or there is not going to radically upend things. So we're trying to move things along every year, hoping for some cooperation from Mother Nature. Next slide, and I think it might be yours, Kari.
So on this slide, we just wanted to show what the previous year's increases have been for the water rates. So in 2017, 2018, 2019, each year had a 9.5% increase. And as Scott said earlier, for 2020, it was an 8.5% increase for both Tier 1 and Tier 2 rates. This is what we have proposed in the 2021 budget model that we're about to take a look at on the next slide. So we're recommending for 2021 for both Tier 1 and Tier 2 that it would be a 3% increase. So this is lower than we've had in the past years. It's also lower than what we had been projecting for this year in the long-term plan. However, trying to look at what we could do to have the increase for customers more manageable. So kind of keeping affordability in mind and seeing what we could accomplish, like as Scott said, with moving some of the capital projects out a little bit. And so if you're looking at the utility bills are billed every 8 weeks, so like every 2 months, they're bi-monthly. So if you're looking at a bi-monthly bill, the Tier 1 rate applies to the first 12,000 gallons of water, which is 6,000 gallons a month. And then in that 2-month period, the Tier 2 rate kicks in for if it goes over 12,000 gallons. And so you can see for the rates, it's per 1,000 gallon. It's for Tier 1, a 12-cent increase, and Tier 2, a 21-cent increase. This next slide, this is the long-term budget model for the water fund. And it's anticipating similar water usage patterns, kind of with wetter weather, and includes projected revenues of just over 16 million. And the proposed expenses in the budget are around 17 million, which include upcoming capital projects of 2.5 million, with long-term projections in the next several years requiring capital funding of approximately 2 to 3.5 million per year for infrastructure projects. And as we said, with the wet weather and the lower demand for water and smaller than originally projected rate increase, the working capital balance, it does remain a positive balance, but is significantly lower than the goal for this fund, which is indicated by the highlighted in red amount for the working capital balance. So we'll be working with that, looking out for the future planning of this fund to try to get that back up in future years. So those are the slides for the water fund. Are there any questions?
Council, any questions of either Ms. Carlson or Mr. Anderson about the water and the water utility funds? Councilmember Beloga and then Councilmember Coulter.
Don't know. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Don't know if I should address this to you, Carrie, or to you, Scott, so I'll just throw it out there. What was the original forecast for 2021's water increase?
Do you recall, Scott?
I thought it was either 8 or 8.5%.
Right.
I think it was in that 8 to 9 area. So, that corresponds to my memory. So what would 2022 look like?
So for 2022 in this model, Kari, is it not correct? We've got a 5% increase plugged in?
Yes, that is correct. Thank you, Scott.
And just a net, or maybe to say it differently, help me understand. In under expenses, capital outlay, we've got for 2021 2550, and then we have down below under capital projects, 2895. Shouldn't those numbers be the same?
Mayor, council members, Councilmember Beloga, I can explain that. So the numbers on the bottom that are in italics are the making up the balance of that working capital goal for the fund. And so we try to have the cash in that fund the year prior to the capital. So those capital numbers are the numbers that are coming up in the next year.
Got it. Thank you.
Councilmember Coulter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick question, and I'm sure this has been asked before, but the working capital balance is quite low. And is that just because of the sort of the continual outlay for capital projects, or what is the reason for that?
Mayor Bussey, Councilmember Coulter, I think generally speaking, the capital balance has been a victim of just lack of revenue, really dating back. And I'll keep using 2012 as a reference because that's the first year that I recall. And looking, it's probably not the first year. That's a marker year that I recall, kind of starting to look back to see. Looking at weather and impacts on revenue, where we've just, I think from 2012 to 2020, we had one, what I'd call a normal year in terms of production and distribution and revenue, and every other year has just missed significantly due to lack of summer sales. So I think what you're looking at, that balance, it's just been it's 2020 like 2019 like 2018. It's the only difference this year is we had another player in terms of a pandemic that led to taking a bite out of revenues as opposed to just weather. So while we've been unfortunately coming before you trying to offset that carefully with rate increases, but recognizing times are a little different now, trying to go about it even a little more softly, but recognizing that this is an ongoing concern for sure.
I guess, and we can move on and I can get this information online, but I guess I'd like to know a little bit more about what the implications are for that. I mean, as we look, in the tails here, I mean, it gets even well below 50% of the goal. And that's a concerning number to me, particularly insofar as it describes water infrastructure. And we've seen in places like Flint, Michigan, and around the country what happens when water infrastructure is not properly maintained. So I can get that information. If we can have another conversation separately, but I'd just like to know a little bit more about the implications of that. So thank you.
Mayor, council members, Councilmember Coulter, I can say that in the more looking out for further years, if we are projecting to come back up to more of like a 9% rate increase, let's say starting in 2023, that does start to come back out of the red. But that would require larger increases in outer years unless we have really dry years where we are selling more water.
Council, additional questions on the water utility fund? I do want to say, Councilmember Coulter, I appreciate your comments and the totals in the working capital balance. I do want to make clear that we're not in a Flint, Michigan scenario here, and we're not even in that neighborhood. So I just want to make sure we don't leave people with that impression. It is certainly in the red because we're not getting our working capital balance up to our working capital goal, but we're not in a crisis situation like they are in Flint, Michigan in any way, shape, or form. So Seeing no further questions regarding the water utility, let's move on to the wastewater utility fund.
All right, and that is still Scott Anderson.
Thank you, Kari, Mayor Bussey, council members. So much like the water utility, this fund accounts for all the operation, maintenance, and ultimate replacement of the city's wastewater collection system, as well as charges from the Metropolitan Council Environmental Services to treat that wastewater. So our day-to-day maintenance includes lift station maintenance, cleaning of main line to prevent system blockages, addressing infiltration and inflow, all to get that flow down. And we're dealing with about 360 miles of pipe, 28 lift stations. Next slide. And actually, you can stay here, but I'll just talk briefly. The wastewater utility presentation always seems to be a little bit shorter and more simple than the water utility, and I think that's because while wastewater revenue is tied to water revenue, it's not tied so tightly in terms of as you know, residential customers, they pay their wastewater rates based on that winter use. So we're not capturing, if somebody's filling a swimming pool or watering their lawn, that doesn't go into the sewer. So we don't, there's no charge for that. And so while water use definitely impacts sewer use and revenue, it's not a victim to the kind of the wild swings that can accompany water summer use. So you get a shorter presentation on wastewater. So what we have here are our wastewater rates, again, in comparison to our neighbors and peer cities throughout the metro. And again, we're happy to share this information because we feel as though the city of Bloomington has remained absolutely competitive in this field, and have favorable rates for our customers. Next slide.
Back to me. Yep. So for the wastewater rate, as Scott explained, it has some different drivers. And as you'll see in a minute, when we look at the budget model for this fund, you were comfortable at leaving this rate the same and not increasing the wastewater rate. So leaving it at $4.99 per 1,000 gallons. And this is why. So with leaving the wastewater rate the same for 21, then that would be proposed revenues of just over 13 million and expenses of just under 13 million. And as you can see, the working capital balance is projected to be right in line with the goal for this fund. So that was much shorter than the water fund. Are there any questions about wastewater?
Council, questions on the wastewater utility fund?
Well, one other thing I was going to mention is a big cost for this fund is what we pay to the Met Council for treating the sewer runoff. And actually for 2021, that rate is going to be less in 2021 than 2020. A little bit.
Thank you for the clarification. Councilmember Beloga.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Carrie, is there any prohibitions of making in-fund transfers between water and wastewater or working capital?
Mayor and council members, Councilmember Beloga, there's not. I don't know in the past if we've done transfers between water and wastewater. I do know when we have our comprehensive annual financial report, we actually show these two funds together. and that they're very kind of intertwined, and a lot of people do work in both funds. So that might be something that we could consider, the council could consider.
Well, and it's, we have a shortfall in looking at our working capital balance to the goal, or water and a surplus in wastewater. So it seems like a reasonable partial solution to do a transfer between the funds, since they are so interrelated.
I would agree, Councilmember Beloga. A good suggestion, something to consider. I would note that the working capital balance and the working capital goal are, for the most part, within $1 million of each other. So it's not a huge windfall, but it's certainly, every little bit would certainly help. So something to consider. Council, any other questions or comments regarding the wastewater utility? Seeing none, let's move on to the stormwater utility fund.
Okay, thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Kari. Thank you, Council and Mayor.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks for being with us this evening.
All right, and so for the stormwater utility, Brian Greedle is on tonight's meeting, and he will be going over the next few slides.
Okay, good evening, Mayor and council members. I'll apologize ahead of time. I'm not quite sure what's going on with my video feed. So I don't know. I'm sure it's user error, so I apologize about that.
We'll work through it. Good evening, welcome.
Thank you. So similar to the wastewater, the stormwater utility fund provides for the operation, maintenance, improvement, and replacement for the city's storm sewer system. And users are charged a fee for the costs associated with managing the storm sewer system and the stormwater runoff within the city. Within Bloomington, we've got over 150 miles of mainline storm sewer pipe, about 8,000 catch basins, a little over 1,600 manholes, 300 different water bodies that we manage, and 6 lift stations. In addition to the infrastructure, the stormwater utility also supports the work of the Richfield Bloomington WMO and compliance with the NPDES MS4 permit, which is administered by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So the MS4 permit has 6 different sections to it, including public outreach and education. So with that, we run briefing articles, social media posts. We have a partnership with Clean Water Minnesota to help engage with the public. We have a public participation component, which we fund things such as the Wetland Health Evaluation Program, which is a partnership with Hennepin County that adopt a storm drain program that you may be familiar with. We also look at, the third group then would be our illicit discharge detection and elimination. So essentially looking at and investigating any discharges to the storm sewer system that are not stormwater runoff. We also have a construction site stormwater runoff program where we're out on different construction sites throughout the community, monitoring those primarily for sediment and erosion control. We have our post-construction stormwater management, which goes through and reviews different developments and projects throughout the city for compliance with city stormwater standards. And then we also have a program for municipal stormwater operations. So the storm utility also supports any work required as part of approved total maximum daily loads, which is also sometimes referred to as TMDLs. Next slide, Kari.
So for stormwater rates, they're determined by land use category at a per acre rate. And we are proposing for 2021 a 2% increase to those rates. And then just wanted to point out that each single family residential lot is considered to be 1/3 of an acre. So the proposed 2021 rate would be $8.13, and that would go up 16 cents.
Mayor and council members, so this chart shows the same cities that you saw earlier in the stormwater or the sanitary sewer comparison. However, this one is with regards to the stormwater utility fees. And what a stormwater utility fee supports does vary from city to city. So in Bloomington, we support the street sweeping program, our MS4, MPDS permit related items such as sump basin, structure cleanouts, essentially cleaning out our BMPs that filter out sediment and pollutants. All of our inspection activity related to permit requirements, as well as inspection activity for upcoming PMP projects. We also support maintenance activity as well as improvements to the drainage system itself. We have in a typical year, we have a storm sewer maintenance project that runs during the summer months. We have a pond maintenance project that is typically run in the winter to reduce our environmental impact and reduce the risk associated with working at the end of the pipe. And also the stormwater utility funds the maintenance and improvements to the system that are completed through the PMP projects. So, any storm sewer work that is completed as part of a PMP project is funded entirely from the stormwater utility and is not included in any assessments. So all of this work is completed in addition to the in-house related maintenance work that's completed by our maintenance department, such as I'm not sure how many of you saw the sinkhole that was out on West Old Shakopee Road this year near Rich, but that was a significant impact to a highly traveled route, and our maintenance department was able to get that fixed and repaired and get the lane closures removed within about a week. So it is very advantageous for us to have a skilled maintenance crew out there helping us manage this as well. Next slide. So consistent with what Public Works was doing and with the Community Budget Advisory Committee and looking at budgets, we did go through and make some reductions, the travel and similar things like that. The big ticket item in the storm utility budget this year is the planning for the Oxborough Lake project, where we have a planned removal of approximately 100,000 yards of accumulated sediment. We've had this project programmed in the budget and saving for it for the last few years now. And we have been collecting our sediment samples. We've got our survey information. And so the project is getting close to ready to go. This area Oxborough Lake in particular is the last water quality basin for about 1,200 acres, after which flows go directly to 9 Mile Creek. It goes in over at the Harrison Park outfall, just south of 100th Street there. And so the sediment level has been determined to be level 2 material as far as the PAH contamination goes. Through our conversations with different contractors, level 2 material almost always ends up at the landfill as well, even though it's not governed by the PCA. According to MPCA guidelines, level 2 material would be acceptable for industrial fill. However, in talking with several contractors out there, they say that they don't have a site that's willing to take this material. So most often it does end up at the landfill, which does increase cost. So we have been working on some more creative ways that could result in project savings, such as saving some of the material and creating islands out in the lake or something of that nature, or looking at the possibility of having a separate disposal contract with the facility, and that way we would avoid any contractor markup on the disposal rate. So Oxborough Lake is the main driver of the stormwater budget here for 2021. I think the next one is you, Kari.
Yes. So here is the 20 or the long-term budget model for the stormwater utility fund. And the 2021 proposed budget includes total revenue of just over 7.2 million and proposed expenses of 11.5 million. That includes 7.2 million for capital projects. And also for this fund, the working capital balance is projected to be in line with the goal. Are there any questions about the stormwater utility fund budget and rates?
Council, question on stormwater utility funds. No questions? Let's move on to the solid waste utility fund.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. All right, and then we have Laura Horner is here, and she is going to be going through these next last slides. This is the last fund we have to look at tonight of the utility funds, and this is the solid waste utility.
Good evening and welcome. Laura, I think you need to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you. Welcome.
Thank you. So good evening, Mayor Bussey and council members. Last but not least, we have the Solid Waste Utility Fund. Tonight we'll review what makes up the Solid Waste Fund. We'll review how our rates are structured and our rates for 2021. So the Solid Waste Utility Fund accounts for the citywide garbage, recycling, and yard waste program. It accounts for our spring curbside cleanup program, forestry and removal of diseased trees, such as emerald ash borer infested trees that were discussed earlier this evening. It funds cleanup after major storm events and private property environmental health abatements. Next slide, Kari. So on this slide, you can see how our garbage and recycling rates are structured. The residential garbage rates are made up of 4 components, as shown in bold and red on this slide. So the 4 components that make up the garbage rate are the collection and disposal rate, as set in our contract with the consortium, the city's administrative fee, and the state solid waste taxes and county fees. So looking further at that garbage rate, the garbage collection rate is a fixed rate, and that will increase 2.5% in 2021 as set in our contract. So that's about a 13-cent increase from 2020. The next part of the garbage rate is the disposal rate, and that's also set in our contract. And this portion of the garbage rate is only adjusted if there is a change in the garbage tipping fee that we pay at the Hennepin Energy Recovery Center where our garbage is incinerated. HERC is not increasing fees in 2021, and so therefore this portion of the rate will not change. The next portion is the city administrative fee. This is set by the city, and this covers the city's billing, our customer service, education, and contract administration. And this portion of the rate is not going to increase in 2021. And lastly, our rate includes the state solid waste tax and county fee. This is a 25.25% tax that the city residents pay on their utility bill. The city collects this and we pass it on to the county and state. So then looking at our recycling cart charges, the recycling rate is made up of 2 portions, the collection rate and new this year, a recycling commodity adjustment offset. So that collection rate is set in our contract, just like the garbage rate, and this will increase 2.5% in 2021. And new for 2021, the recycling rate will also include, as I mentioned, the recycling commodity adjustment offset fee. The name is a bit of a mouthful. This fee is established annually in October, and it's a form of a revenue or cost share in our recycling rate. The fee is based on the previous 12 months of the published commodity index prices for the recyclables that are collected, including aluminum, glass, plastics, paper, and cardboard. It's based on the composition of our recycling that we establish through annual recycling sorts and our recycling tonnages. And you may recall that when we were negotiating the contract last year, we estimated that this offset fee would be much higher. However, based on the current recycling makeup and current recycling markets, and also because we were able to negotiate a relatively competitive recycling processing fee, this fee will be much lower than we anticipated, and it will be a 5-cent increase. Next slide, Kari. So on this slide here, you can see our rates from 2020 as compared to 2021, and our garbage and recycling rates will increase 36 cents for each cart size for the garbage and recycling plus taxes monthly. This increase is again due to the collection rate increases for garbage and recycling, as well as that new recycling offset fee. And on the next slide here, we are reviewing our rates in Bloomington as compared to rates found in other metro cities. We were able to do a review of other cities in the metro, and it should be noted that these prices are adjusted based on a few factors to make the rates more of an apples to apples comparison, including factors like who does the billing and where the garbage is disposed of. As you can see in this table, Bloomington, our rate in 2021 is fairly competitive with other rates. Our rate is higher than average rates found in competitive RFP contract cities, but it is lower than the average found in other negotiated contract prices. Bloomington has a negotiated contract, and it is also lower than the open hauling rate. Now, this open hauling rate was established through a 2015 survey that the city conducted of approximately 275 residences who voluntarily submitted copies of their solid waste invoices from their haulers at that time. And the invoices were received for services from all 7 licensed haulers in Bloomington at that time. In 2015, that rate was found to be $26.66. And we adjusted that for today's prices. Moving on from the garbage and recycling rates, we will discuss the curbside cleanup fee. This fee funds both the city's curbside cleanup program, and it also builds a reserve for major storm debris cleanup that might be needed after an emergency storm, after a storm and emergency situation. So this fee is $4.42 per month. It's $53.04 a year, and this will not increase in 2021. And we also wanted to make note of the fact that this year there are 2 city questions related to the residential solid waste collection program on the ballot in Bloomington this year, as you are aware. So if as a result of the election, voters do decide to end city organized collection, those solid waste fees that are set in Chapter 11 of our city code would not be necessary. In addition, the curbside cleanup program would also end, and those curbside cleanup fees would not be necessary either. So if that does occur, and understanding that a portion of the curbside cleanup fee funds major storm cleanup, that would move to the forestry budget beginning in 2022. And there will be a public hearing for contingent solid waste ordinance changes next Monday on October 19th. And those ordinances are posted on the city's website and would amend Chapter 10 and 11 of City Code and have effective dates that again are contingent on the possible outcomes of the state general election on November 3rd. And further discussion related to that possible transition period from city organized collection would also occur at that October 19th meeting.
All right. Thank you very much, Laura. So here is the budgeted long-term model for the solid waste. So total budgeted revenues for 2021 are just over 8.2 million, and total budgeted expenses are just over 8.6 million. And I will just point out that for this utility fund, there is property tax support of 185,000, and that is requested for forestry and removal of diseased trees, which we've been talking about this evening, such as emerald ash borer. So are there any questions about solid waste for Laura or for me?
Council, any questions regarding the solid waste fund? Questions at all? If not, back to you, Ms. Carlson. Let's move it along.
So just have a couple more slides and then I will be done. So just, that was an overall recap. Some of the key drivers for utility rates, as we talked about, especially for water, the need to build capital reserves for repair and replacement of aging infrastructure. And that is the case for water, wastewater, and stormwater. And then the wet summers that we've been having that are resulting in declining revenue compared to past years. And then just to bring this all together, what it looks like, we had Brenda Greenwald in our customer billing supervisor, customer billing department for utility billing, put some numbers together just to show samples of what a residential utility bill would look like at different levels. So these three different boxes represent, so the one on the left would be like minimum of 4,000 gallons in a month of water usage and a small garbage can. And then in the middle would be, the 11,000 gallon usage and a medium garbage. And then on the right would be large garbage and using 22,000 gallons in a bi-monthly period. So just to show these different rate increases that we're proposing for those 4 different utility funds. And so for example, with the kind of minimum uses that it would go for and we're talking about for a bi-monthly bill, so every 8 weeks, that it would go from $98.14 to $99.65 for that smaller usage example. And underneath each different scenario here, you can see if you look for the whole year, so we get these bills 6 times a year, that for the smaller usage, it would be a little over $9 for the year. And for medium usage, a little over $14 for the year. And then for the high usage, where like for the water, once you go past the 16,000 gallons for the 2 months, it's going to go into tier 2. That would be $27.48. So that is my last slide. Oh, no, it's not. It's not my last slide. The last thing I have to say is that we'll be back. There's a public hearing scheduled for November 23rd, and that's when these budgets would be brought to council for approval, and also when the ordinances will be brought to council for the 2021 utility rates.
Thank you. And I do want to say thank you for bringing the sample of residential utility bills 2020 versus 2021, the previous slide. Bringing all that information together, I think that's useful and it's helpful because we've been talking about this. We look at these as a standalone kind of thing, but they all aggregate together and they come together, and it's the cost of living in Bloomington. It's the cost of doing business for the city of Bloomington and for living in Bloomington. If you're using the if you do recycling, if you have to pay the water, the sewer, and so on. So to bring everything together like that is helpful, and to see that the increases are for the first tier there, for that 4,000 gallons in a small garbage, it's an additional 75 cents a month. And appreciate bringing that information, putting it in the aggregate, and letting people look at it in that way. So well done with that. Council, additional questions, comments?
Thank you very much.
Seeing none, thank you very much. Thank you, Kari, and thanks for everybody else who pitched in on that portion of the agenda. It's useful and informative, so thank you very much.
Thanks.
And we can move on to item 2.5, the council rules of procedure. We've been talking about this for a while, and it always ends up being the thing that we kind of kick down the road because we get too late sometimes, and it's a topic that I'd like to take on and continue to take on and make sure that we get through at least a portion of it tonight. We don't necessarily have to finish, but to spend some time moving forward with it. And Ms. Manderscheid is here to lead us through, and I think it would be helpful, Melissa, to go with specific page numbers within the packet, because I know there's a lot here, and I think we've got a lot of different things organized in different ways. So whatever you can do to help us along would be appreciated.
Absolutely, Mark. I'm prepared to do that. All right. I feel like I should have some WWE intro music, because this is just something we've been kicking down the road for so long. It's just so exciting, and I know you all just can't wait. So you can just run something in your head, maybe like Thunderstruck, or I don't know. All right. So just as a reminder to kind of ground us all as to where we have been and getting us up to this point tonight. So we, if you recall, started this process last year, and we had divided, or I had asked you if you would be okay if I divided the rules of procedure into a couple of categories to make the discussion easier, because we were spending a fair amount of time talking about generalities and getting sort of some basics underway. I put those at the beginning of the request for council action and carried those through. We talked back in December, I believe it was, about some general changes that we all had wanted to make. Yeah, it was December 16th or so, December around then. And then at the first meeting in January, on January 2nd, you all amended the order of business, which is in section 9 of the rules of procedure, and only that section at that time. It was an amendment by resolution 2020-2, and we did that and only that at that time because we were in the process of implementing a new software program, and we needed to set that and make that change, and did only that at that time. Now we're on the heels of those decisions back earlier this year, and we have been meeting a couple of times. We met in January, February, July, August, a couple times in August, and then we picked up the final section, section C, category C, in September. We had to move it due to time. On September 14th, we moved it to October 5th, and on October 5th, it was tabled until tonight. So just as a reminder, I've been keeping track of the edits that we've made or the comments that you've made at each of the meetings. We've been talking through each of them. And the plan, as I understand it, is to bring those all back together for your final review and act on it in a resolution at a future council meeting date. I believe we have it tentatively scheduled for November. I believe there's a desire to get it in place as soon as possible. And I also believe that there was a desire based on the last time we talked that you all were interested in seeing some samples from some other communities. And so in the last couple of packets that have been before you, there were provided for your consideration 2 samples from 2 other charter cities that we often talk about as being somewhat similar to us, either in geography or in size. And so I've included those for your consideration here, Minnetonka's and Rochester's. I also took a look at Egan's, and I also took a look at St. Louis Park. And the St. Louis Park one, I believe they use the Sturgis model of rules and not the Roberts. And although that was very concise and I thought it might be helpful, I thought it might confuse things because it is another body of parliamentary procedure. So I focused and only included those two, Minnetonka and Rochester, which are in your packet. I know the chief and I have talked a couple of times about the rules of procedure and the role of the sergeant at arms in that process. And I believe that he is also available for question and answer when we get to that stage of the discussion. So with that, as an introduction, I will get started. As a reminder, this is page 45 of the agenda packet. That's the first section. And we will be talking about category C. The first section is section 10, which is hearing procedures, and that's on page 60 of your agenda packet. Before we get started, are there any questions?
Any questions? And I'm sorry, Melissa, did you say page 60 or 68 that we're starting on?
660.
60, thank you.
And then if you'll probably recall from previous discussions, I have numerous documents in front of me. So if there's a lot of paper shuffling, that's why I'm looking through the various, conversations and content that we've had from prior discussions. So bear with me if it takes me a little bit of time to get back to you on specific questions. Before we start with section 10, is there anything else that anyone would like to chat about? One other thing I guess I'll add is that, we've been working on this for over a year, and a lot of things have happened in the world in that time period. And I'm very much interested in evolving this document so that it works well for your practical purposes, as well as in meeting your perhaps broader policy objectives and public participation. So if you have, I am talking from the edits that we have been working through back dating almost a year ago. So, excuse me. So if there are larger substantive edits that you would like to see either in the sections we're talking about tonight or in new sections that you would like added, I will certainly bring those back. I'll integrate those and bring those back for your future consideration. But the comments that I have for you tonight are the ones that we've been talking through this for the last 9 months or so. So with regard to page 60, hearing procedure, the only edit that we've been talking about to date is making that change about the current version of Robert's Rules. If you recall, the document referenced the 10th edition. They've now published the 11th edition. And we had made a decision a while back to reference just the most current edition of Robert's Rules. Each edition, we have copies of all of them. The current 11th edition rounds out at 716 pages. I think the previous edition is about 30 pages less than that. And so it's easier for us to be working from the most current edition, and I think we all agreed on that. Is there any concern about that? I don't believe so. All right.
I don't see any concern. Let's move on.
Anything else in that hearing procedure section? Again, this is basic meeting protocols. A lot of this is in an effort to assist the person, the secretary, Denise, in our case, so that when she goes back and reviews the council recording, she can know who's speaking. And so people have to be recognized by the presiding officer. They speak when spoken to. All dialogue goes through the presiding officer, those sorts of things. All right, moving on to section 12, which is on page 62. This is rules of debate. In this section, it's again, participation. We don't have any specific suggested edits for this. It is working again through the fact that remarks go through the presiding officer. how to get the floor, how to handle interruptions, what should be entered into the minutes. That's pretty much the gist of that. There are no specific edits proposed to that section. Does anyone have any questions about rules of debate?
Any comments there, Council? Onward.
All right. The next section is on the following page, addressing the council. In that first section, written communications, this indicates that anyone from the public is able to address the council through written communications. You'll see that on all the agenda packets and as well as on the city website. It's also present on the public hearing notices portion of the city website, so that if folks are not able to participate in person or via the electronic option that we currently have, they're always able to participate in writing. And those, when received sufficiently in advance, are provided to the council members prior to the meeting. It also indicates in this section that any person desiring to address the council needs to secure the permission of the presiding officer. That's a decorum and a control of the discussion to make sure that everybody's time is honored and everybody is able to be heard. Another section here is B, oral communications. I'm recommending a change to this section. Right now it says taxpayers or residents of the city, and I'm recommending that instead be members of the public. This relates to who can provide oral communications on city business to the council during a meeting. I'm recommending this change to members, not because I don't think that taxpayers and residents should be heard, but rather because we could be challenged by somebody saying, sort of approving up of your residency requirement, or if you're a minor and you have a contribution and you're not otherwise a taxpayer because you don't own property. The other aspect of this is that we don't want to limit our communications to only people from the jurisdictional boundaries of the city of Bloomington, because oftentimes our items are multi-jurisdictional and we want to hear information from other jurisdictions. So this just seems to me like a modernization, and it does not prohibit it, for example, hearing residents first. It's just broadening up the scope of people that can provide oral communications. And then the last part is about the minutes of speech, but I think we should talk about this first topic and then move on to minutes of speech.
Council, any comments on that? I mean, my 2 cents. I think it makes good sense to revise the language to include members of the public. You're right. We see many people in front of the council who are not necessarily from the city of Bloomington, but they're representing a company in the city of Bloomington, or they are the legal representation of someone, or for whatever reason, they're not necessarily a specific taxpayer or resident of the city, but they're a member of the public. And you're right, we can still prioritize Bloomington city residents in terms of the debate, but I don't think we should limit it to that in our language. And I think this change makes perfectly good sense. I don't know what others think, if they disagree with that at all.
I'd also add that it's kind of challenging to verify that kind of information in a live council meeting. So,
agreed.
I'm not seeing much opposition. So I'll make that change. The second topic that I'm proposing for editing in this section is the time limit. If you'll recall, our current rules of procedure have 2 different time limits in them. There is a 3-minute time limit for public comment, or excuse me, there's a 5-minute time limit for public comment and a 3-minute for items that are on the agenda for a public hearing. And we had discussed whether we wanted to continue that approach or if we wanted to make it more uniform. There was some discussion about, do we want to just say 5 minutes across the board, 4 minutes, 3 minutes? The council as a body can always agree to grant more time to a speaker. I will say that in general, what I observed and among other cities is somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes. And so, I mean, there are certainly outliers as well, but generally between 3 and 5 minutes is what I've seen on that. So I had just put a placeholder in her of 5 minutes related to oral communications based on previous discussions. But since then, we've had more discussions about this. So I'm curious if you have any feedback on the topic of number of minutes.
Councilmember Lohman, I see, has some feedback on the limit of minutes.
Yeah, my personal opinion on this one is I like having the discretion of the presiding officer to decide this. One of the things we saw just in the recent piece, he decided to give some time to the developer to speak. I can't remember how much time you granted the developer, and then you also gave additional time to speak first to the person who you thought was the organizer of that. Now, if you limit the amount of time here, then we're going to have to go through a whole lot of parliamentary procedure to adjust that. And I got to tell you, these meetings really go long. And so I really trust the presiding officer to kind of say, hey, this is what the number needs to be at for this particular time. I could imagine if we set this at 5 minutes on some of these things, we would be in session till 3 and 4 in the morning because we put 5 minutes on the on there. Whereas we know we've got a big crowd of people waiting there. Maybe it makes sense to do 2 minutes, or maybe it makes sense to. So I really want to, in my opinion, I think less is more. I think the way we have it right now with nothing on there is the way we ought to have keep it.
Council, any response to that? Any other thoughts on that? Councilmember Beloga?
I think Councilmember Lohman has laid it out nicely, and I agree. I just think it's warranted by the circumstances rather than a blanket.
So right now we don't have, correct me if I'm wrong, Melissa, but right now we don't have anything specifically in there about how long in a, for example, a public hearing, or how long folks may speak other than in public comment. Is that correct? So by adding this on to oral communication, that's the part where we're actually adding a specific time limit. Is that correct?
Mayor, members, yes, I believe so. Under manner of addressing council in section 16, it talks about 3 minutes, to address the council, and there's one other reference to time. There are periodic references throughout these rules about the amount of time. It was one of the things that I wanted to make sure to do a last check. But what I hear you saying is something more general, in that the presiding officer has the ability to limit the time for speakers. I'm looking for, and I remember seeing an example of how, I believe it was Minnetonka that did it this way.
I do think that's the direction that does make sense. I think a couple of different ways. First of all, within public comment period, I think we do need to have the set time period, because it's set as a 20-minute period. We don't want somebody to take up the whole time. So a specific 5 minute, as we've done in the past, I think makes sense. But if there is an agreement of the council, does it make sense to, anytime there is a time limit reference, to find some common language where it says something along the lines of the limit of time that speakers may speak can be determined by the be determined as long as it's uniformly enforced, something along those lines. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And that way, if we have 100 people in line, we can say, yeah, we'll give given 2 minutes. If we have 2 people who want to speak on it, we can show a little bit more flexibility, that we can have the discussion, much like we did, as Councilmember Lohman said, we did the other night when the developer spoke, and then the spokesperson from the neighborhood had roughly equal time.
Right.
Mayor, might I suggest that we take this offline and come back with language for this later, since we're not going to make the decision about this right now and keep moving?
We could do that. I see Councilmember Carter and Councilmember Coulter would like in, and I think Councilmember Beloga as well. So let's get their comments in on the record for the moment. Councilmember Carter?
I just want to clarify, because I heard a couple times for the public comment period 5 minutes, but I'm seeing 3 minutes. And so I guess I just want to clarify that quickly.
Mayor, members, I'm speaking about paragraph B. Public comment is in paragraph C. So we're talking about
Yes.
paragraph B right
Yep,
now.
I understand that, but you referenced the public comment period a couple times, and you said 5 minutes, and I just want to make sure everybody knows that we have 3 minutes in there. So I'm fine with Councilmember Lohman's suggestion to take that specific sentence offline and come back with a recommendation.
Councilmember Coulter?
Thank you, Mayor. I guess I don't have any particular objection to removing a specific time reference. I guess my concern is, there obviously there are certain duties and responsibilities that fall to the presiding officer. But my concern would be ensuring that whatever that, if we're not putting a specific time limit in there, that's a decision made by the entire council rather than solely the presiding officer. This is just sort of one of my, if we get a bad actor in place and someone decides, oh, this is a really controversial issue and I just want to push things through, I'm going to say, 2 minute or 1 minute or 30-second time limit, right? So I would just prefer to sort of broaden that authority rather than vest it in one person in this instance, just because I see a potential for misuse, not necessarily obviously by the current mayor, but by some hypothetical future person. So to the extent I think that we can put some accountability measures in there, I'd like to see a little bit more of that. But I don't, if that's in there, I don't have any issue with no specific time frame.
All right. Councilmember Nelson?
All right. Thank you, Mayor. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
I guess my comment is I'm hesitant to have anything that is seen as limiting people's time because there's a lot of people that want to speak on it versus if it's appropriate to allow someone or some people more time on an issue to allow them to speak. The example that was raised was, I think it made sense to have the project developer provide a fuller story for us to understand that project and what they were attempting to do and how it might fit into the community. And so I'm wondering if it makes sense to have some type of at least minimum or normal standard and then allow the mayor discretion to allow for more time. I also think the idea of a spokesperson of people either for or against an issue getting more time makes absolute sense. I think there's something currently in there about that, but I'm a little hesitant to have anything that limits people's ability, even if we're there until late into the morning. If people want to speak on an issue, I personally think they should have that opportunity and provide that information to the public, or to the council for our decision.
Thank you, Councilmember Nelson. So I think the suggestion was we take this offline and get a recommendation. I see Councilmember Beloga wants to chime in one more time. Councilmember Beloga?
I've always understood that we were talking about members of the public rather than presenters. So is that a misunderstanding on my part?
No, I think that's what I was understanding. This is basically, I'm reading this as during public hearings, is what I'm understanding this to be, not as presenters on either side of a specific topic. So if they're an official representative presenting an issue, we've never put time limits on those folks.
I just wanted to clarify. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Yep. So Melissa, are we still? Have we had enough? Have we brought forward enough? Could you cobble something together here that at least points us in the right direction and again is fodder for discussion as we head forward here?
I think so. I will say that, Mayor members, as you likely recall from previous discussions, there are very few limitations that the council can make with regard to public contributions from the public. First Amendment related limitations. Those limitations are generally referred to as time, place, and manner, and time being the amount of time. One of the tricky parts of having different time limits is that the city opens itself up potentially to content-based allegations that there are content-based restrictions. So that is the genesis of my wanting to recommend a certain set of time. You can certainly have a different amount of time for each hearing. You know, for example, you said you want to limit everybody's speech to 2 minutes, or you want to allow the sort of the representative speaker of the next 15 speakers, potential speakers, to speak on behalf of them. It gets tricky, and I think you know that in trying to manage all these, especially virtually. So I just want to advise you that without a specific time limit in here, you do have a slight increased exposure to claims that people have not received the same amount of time, and those restrictions were related to the in content or the content that you believe that they were about to speak on. So I can certainly take the conversation offline, and I know I've talked to you about this before, so I don't think I need to talk about it anymore, but that is the nature of why I made the recommendation with regard to the amount of time.
Understood and appreciated. Councilmember Lohman?
Never mind. I just want to make sure we're moving towards offline stuff, because my next question is going to be, which I'll ask offline, is how many lawsuits have cities had? And I don't want to answer now. We can take it offline. I'll give you a call.
Okay. All right. Public comment period. I will tell you, Lohman, Councilmember Lohman, several. But with regard to public comment period, now this is the portion of the agenda. I have a couple of edits that were made in the document that you have before you on page 63. In the intervening time since December, I've had the opportunity to talk to some other cities about how they handle public comment, and I want to just propose something for your consideration before I start talking about this. Might there be a desire on the part of this body to move public comment period rules such that we would allow people to speak on items on the consent agenda? And we would move public comment to before then. Right now, we have public comment occurring after consent business. Some communities have experienced positive experience with moving public comment to before the consent agenda and allowing the public to speak on matters that are on the consent agenda. The one benefit I see of this is that it decreases the likelihood that someone does not realize that an item that's on the consent agenda is going to be handled in a group vote, cumulative action. Despite us stating that on the agenda, we occasionally will see somebody, not so much anymore because of COVID, but every now and then, pre-COVID, we would see somebody who was hanging on, believing, waiting for their item to get called when it had been acted on previously. We did, when we implemented the new software, state that very clearly on the consent agenda portion of the agenda. That said, we still occasionally have experiences, and I think most often they come through the recording secretary under normal times, where someone will approach the dais and have a question about something that's on the consent, or they'll be trying to get the attention of the presiding officer related to an item on consent. The process to remove it and to contact their council member is stated there, but it might not be obvious for everybody, or they might feel less comfortable approaching the council members before the meeting, or can't get there before the meeting. So I'll just offer that some communities have taken that approach in moving public comment period to before the consent agenda and allowing for comment only on those items that are on consent and anything else. They wouldn't be able to speak to other items that are on the agenda that have a public hearing, but only to consent and items not on the agenda. So I'll just put that out there for your consideration. And then I'll talk a little bit about the edits that I made back in December to this section. The first edit is taking out the word residents and saying members of the public for the same reasons that I talked about with regard to the paragraph prior, and that it's difficult to verify residency, and do we really want that to be the litmus test? And then that second edit there, not on the agenda, would be about the item that I just discussed now. I removed the reference to the specific time on the agenda for public comment period because it hasn't traditionally been that actual time due to introductory items or timed items that we want to have so that consultants can move along to their other items that night. And I instead switched it to a specific time period of 20 minutes. Now I'll tell you that there are communities that do 15 minutes, they do 10 minutes. The 20 minutes is nothing magical about that. And you might want to consider whether 20 minutes is still the right amount. And then I added that the body can vote to extend the length of the public comment period beyond whatever time you decide it would be. And then I put language in there. You had 5 minutes. I changed it to 3 minutes per speaker on public comment. The last edits are on the following page and have to do with removing gender pronouns. There was one sentence that was struck about terminating the right to a speaker's remarks in the interest of efficiency. It's my recommendation that you remove that sentence and simply allow the person to speak for those 3 minutes. Again, that relates to the content neutral requirement in the First Amendment law.
And then the other change, as we jump to page 64 at the bottom of this section, stating a person's name, but we can't require them to state their address. Is that correct?
Mayor and members, it's my recommendation that you drop that address requirement. There was a case that we found that did not find that to be a good requirement for people to add. I definitely understand, or legally, they challenge the legality of requiring someone to provide their address. I will say also that we remove people's addresses out of the packet when someone's submitting public comment. Not because it's not public data, but because in my experience, sometimes those addresses are harvested and put on lists. And I wouldn't ever want somebody to feel that they shouldn't participate and provide public comment because they're concerned that their address or their email address is going to be harvested. So the staff has removed those for that reason. And I feel like the similar point is present, concern is present in requiring someone to provide their address. That said, I think it is very valuable if somebody says, I live in the neighborhood, or I live on the same street, or I live 2 streets from here, or I don't even live anywhere near this particular property. That is relevant, and certainly could be asked in sort of a follow-up question, or people could be encouraged to provide their location.
Got it. Council comment on the public comment period. Councilmember Coulter, Councilmember Nelson. I didn't see whose hand went up first. So, Councilmember Nelson. And Councilmember Nelson's hand is down now. Councilmember Coulter.
Thank you, Mayor. And this actually just gets to the very point that was just raised. I plan to bring this up later, but I'm wondering if we could ask folks, I agree it's problematic to require folks to state their address for a variety of reasons. Could we ask folks to state whether or not they are a resident of the city? Because I think to your point, Melissa, that it is, even aside from whether or not someone lives, say, in the neighborhood of a project that we're talking about, when folks speak to us in any capacity, I think it is relevant to know whether they are residents or if they own a business in the city, or, to something to that effect without sort of any kind of specific identifying information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I will figure something out on that. Because I definitely see the value in that as well. I'm not exactly sure if it's residency, but I'll figure that out.
Council, any comments or ideas or thoughts on we say up to 20 minutes just because I think that's what it's been as long as I've been on the council. The 3 or 5 minutes, your input on that. And I think we had the discussion regarding allowing people to speak about things not on the agenda, and moving public comment ahead of the consent agenda would give people the opportunity to talk about a specific item, and it would then level the playing field. If everybody understood that they could speak on something on the consent agenda, and if there was somebody on the opposite side, they certainly would have the opportunity to speak on something on the consent agenda as well. So any thoughts on that as we look to try and make our processes a little more approachable and a little more participatory for folks? Councilmember Coulter and then Councilmember Lowen.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess, I've been thinking about because I remember when we brought up the potential of allowing folks to comment on items on the consent agenda. And I guess I'm just a little bit wary of that. Partially because, the purpose of the consent agenda is that items are generally speaking non-controversial. Obviously, that's not always the case, but that's generally the intent. So there ideally shouldn't be much need for conversation on those items. I guess from my perspective, when it comes to public comment period, either folks are allowed to comment on items on the agenda or they're not, whatever section in the agenda it may be. I think if we say, well, you can comment on the consent agenda, but not, something in the policy and issue update or in organizational business, that feels to me to be a little bit of an arbitrary line. And so I would prefer that line be a little clearer. So my preference would be that folks not comment to any agenda items at all. I think, there will always be folks who think this should be raised publicly, and I think that there is an avenue for that. But I just get wary of sort of lowering distinctions that way.
Councilmember Lohman.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess my comment on the consent piece and comment, I would say, if stated differently, if we want to go ahead and comment on that, why don't we just get rid of the consent agenda entirely and just open it up so that it's agenda items that people can comment on one by one. And I could support that if that's the direction we want to go on. But yeah, I don't, if we don't allow folks to speak on the other items, I think Councilmember Coulter said it pretty eloquently, but I think the direction I would go is to just eliminate that consent agenda piece and just make it a part of the regular agenda, and folks can comment on that. In terms of the, as I like to call it, edits that would help move things forward, one suggestion I have for you, and don't really need your comment on this, why not on page, after the C, public comment period, just go ahead and eliminate from that presiding officer piece all the way down through the end of that paragraph, and then simply add a point which you would talk about the amount of time that the comment period would be, and then the amount of time that that folks had to speak, and just get rid of all the rest of that, because everything else that's in there is covered by Robert Rules of Order. Just my suggestion to the crafter of this, in the interest of making this simpler.
Might be a good way to make it simpler, I would agree. I will say I don't agree with eliminating the consent agenda, because I'm not necessarily thrilled about the idea of 15 public hearings on things like the salt contract for the winter. I don't think that's at all necessary. So
I think you've got my point, Mayor. Yeah, I think there's a reason for that, and yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. But I think that's the alternative I would give to you, is that that's really what we're trying to say. We should get rid of it, and I think that the spirit of that is not what we're trying to do. So I think we're in agreement on that.
Councilmember Carter.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess I just wanted to chime in and say that I do agree with Councilmember Coulter's comments about, you know, keeping it. I would rather err on the side of keeping it simple and clear for residents. I mean, I think we are in these meetings all the time, and so we know the difference between the different portions of the agenda. And I think for residents who aren't always engaging with us and paying attention to the meetings, but are interested in commenting at whatever point for whatever reason, I would want to see us err on the side of simplicity and, you know, have our very clear public hearings and then otherwise keep it clear that we're allowing comments on things that are not on the agenda.
All right, so I'm hearing consensus that we don't necessarily move public comment period ahead of the consent agenda and allow public comment period on items on the consent agenda. And I understand that. That's understandable. Thoughts on Councilmember Lohman's simplification, that if we eliminate it all, it's all covered under Robert's Rules of Order? Do we need that specificity so if it ever comes up as we look to expand or we limit the amount of speaking time for people or anything along those lines, that it can't be challenged because we actually have it in our council rules of procedure? Why don't we, I would leave that to you, Ms. Mandershad, to figure out what the most efficient and effective way of doing that. I mean, there's some merit to cleaning it up in that way, and we did talk last time about the length of our rules of procedure. But at the same time, I think there is some, as I said, there is a use of making sure that people understand exactly what we're doing and why and how and what the limits on some things are. So,
Mayor members, one thing I'll add is that even though our rules are a little bit longer, they are written in very plain language. And although they are covered in Roberts, again, that's a 719-page book. Unless you're going to go to the library or have some sort of weird obsession with parliamentary procedure, which some people do. And I guess it's not necessarily weird. People make a career out of it. But, you know, this is a book, not light reading. It's like 4-point font. So, you know, I do think that our rules are long, but at the same time, they are written in simple language that it's relatively, you know, concise and hits the high points of, you know, the basic stuff that comes up with the most frequency. The nuances and the things that aren't covered in our rules are covered almost always in these. And so, you know, I will, when I work through this final version to bring back to you, be doing some general cleanup. And it will be shorter, you know, once we take out the strike throughs and whatnot. But I do see, you know, I've been mulling all this over for months now, and I do see some value in you know, stating some of this. And I will just remind you all that in an effort to provide an even more condensed version for the public and to aid them in providing public comment and public participation, we did create a one-pager. It's on the city's website. I believe it's on the city council page where the rules of procedure are. And that document Denise would put at the back table of all the council meetings. And as a reminder, our plan is to, when we finalize these rules, we'll update that one pager. We plan to translate it into a couple of languages that are spoken most frequently in Bloomington, and then post that document outside of the chambers. So that the public is aware of the rules and has ability to get a copy of that prior to entering. Several other jurisdictions post their rules outside of the chambers, and have found that to not only be helpful to the public, but also to, it's a good practice to get people aware of the, and more comfortable.
all right. Hearing nobody else jumping up and down in favor of eliminating all text and going back to Robert's rules, and I do agree that there's benefit to having it laid out in front of us. So I think we would want to continue that. The only final question that I have for the group: 3 minutes or 5 minutes? I'm seeing 3. Nathan, Dwayne, what do you think? 3 or 5? 4. Thank you, Nathan. That's helpful. All right. Well, then we'll limit it to 3 minutes each within the public comment period, and that gives us more people speaking at the public comment period. Limited to 3 minutes each. Very good. Thank you very much. All right. We're done with almost 2 sections now.
Oh no, we've made it. I think we've made it through 3. Almost.
Through 3, excuse me.
Okay, section D on the following page, 64, reading of protests. There is an opportunity for people to read protests, and this is saying that those comments would be limited to 5 minutes, but I'm hearing that you probably want me to change that to 3.
Let's make it 3. Yep.
Got it. All right. Moving on to the next section, handling a motion. That's section 14. I think that the only, well, on page 64 and page 65, there's not much other than in C, section C on tabling and postponing. I think that Councilmember Lohman and I will clean up that language and get it to be a little bit more spot on, so that we use the correct language for what we're doing. With regard to motions to reconsider, down on the bottom of F, we have an interesting nuance in our current rules that doesn't necessarily sync with Robert's rules. Under a motion to reconsider, that under Roberts, that needs to be done on the same meeting. And if you're going to do it at a following meeting, it's a motion to repeal or to rescind. So we have this ongoing challenge with our current language, which I attempted to clean up in this edit, but it's sort of like, what is the next meeting? So if you look at that first sentence, it says, who voted on the prevailing side of the issue to make the motion, reconsider its vote on the matter either during the same meeting or at the next regularly scheduled meeting of the council. After first placing it on the agenda, I believe it said. Yeah. So that's a little bit, it's kind of clunky to administer for the presiding officer, and it doesn't jive, sync, whatever, with Roberts. So I would be of an opinion to clean up reconsideration and make it just be during the same meeting that it happens in. So if you want to re-rate, I'm getting double thumbs up from Councilmember Lohman. So that if you want to reconsider something, and you would reconsider it, there's a couple of reasons, but most often it's because you got some new information along the way, or you found out that somebody couldn't get through and they now can, and so you want to hear their testimony, and that testimony makes you change your mind. Something like that. And that happens all within the same meeting. So at the end of the meeting, anything else? Yes, I want to make a motion to reconsider item 7.3 because I just found out that, Mr. Johnson couldn't get through and he owns the property, blah, 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 blah. And then in the alternative, if it was a later meeting, if it was a subsequent meeting and you wanted to reconsider the motion, it would actually be a motion to rescind or a motion to repeal a previous action. And it would be based on, again, additional information or because it's now a bad idea or whatever the case may be. I would like to make this recommendation to you. And I would restate these, I would dramatically revise. It would not look like it does right now, section F, and I would add in the repeal and rescind. And re-alphabetize that section. Anyone, are you okay with that? Or do you really like it the way it is?
Councilmember Coulter?
Thank you, Mayor. I think that's a fantastic idea. I will say from my experience in my day job, I think the motion to reconsider is it meets a very specific legislative purpose, whether it's, like you say, new information comes to light or someone made an error and voted the wrong way or didn't understand something or something like that, as opposed to, no, we're going to go back and correct something we did at a previous meeting or during a previous legislative session. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I guess as long as I have the floor here, one question I have, and as you're rewriting this, maybe this will get addressed. It feels like the rest of that paragraph is a little bit clunky as well in terms of the description of what is and is not the prevailing side. So and I come with no specific suggestions, But if there's some way to sort of clarify that
Yeah.
a little bit, I think that might be helpful.
Yep. Mayor members, I don't disagree. It is clunky, in part because it's a two-step process. First, it's the motion to, do you want to reconsider? And then it's the actual reconsideration. And then there's oftentimes a question of like, who is the prevailing side? So I wanted to try to address that, but I'll take another pass at it and clean it up further.
Councilmember Beloga?
I'd just ask that we get to the language in front of us before we talk about it some more, because what we're talking about is theoretical, and I want to see what the actual language is.
Sure.
So I just suggest we move along here.
Councilmember Beloga, Mayor, Councilmember Beloga, just to give you an example, on page 10 of the Rules of Procedure from Minnetonka is an example of.
I just suggest we move along.
Okay.
Councilmember Lohman.
Just want to say, Melissa, I appreciate the statement about the prevailing side and clarifying that. I know we had a situation earlier on a couple of years back where we had a problem where we had a tie vote and we didn't know what to do. So I appreciate that comment in there. So thank you for putting that in there.
Very good. So, Melissa, if you could craft something as you described to us, I think it would be helpful using Minnetonka on whatever page 10 or as an example. I think that would be a good starting place. And Council, I'm sensing some impatience here to move this along. We have asked staff to do this with us and for us, and I mean it grinds. It's a bit of a grind here. I get that. But we have made that request to staff to try and clean these up and to get this work done. And I understand we're pushing 9:15 here and past 9:15. I hope we could go another 5 minutes or so and then head to our last agenda item. But with the understanding that, of course, we have made this request of staff to help us clean this up and make this a clearer process and a better process. So I understand it. Like I said, it's a bit of a grind, but it's a necessary grind right now.
So, Mayor members, would you like me to go for about another 5 or so minutes? I think we can.
If you could, please, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
All right. So section 15, page 66, addressing the council after motion made. I don't have any recommended changes for that. Basically, you have to get the presiding officer's permission before you start speaking. That's the gist of it. After a motion is made. The next section 16 is the time limit. I heard you all say 3 minutes. I took out the gender pronouns and then uniformly enforcing it to address the content concern. Section 17 is a reminder that if a member doesn't vote, that is recorded as an affirmative vote. Any questions or comments on 15, 16, or 17?
Councilmember Coulter, Beloga, and Lohman.
Just very quickly in section 16, if we're going to add in folks stating whether or not they are a resident of the city, that should probably go in that section as well.
That's a good point. And council members Beloga and Lohman, those were old hands from the last item. Okay, moving on.
So, Mayor, the next section is decorum and enforcement of decorum. That's a lengthy section, and if you're looking for a time to sort of step back, that might be now. I'm happy to continue forward, but I want to also acknowledge that.
I think this strikes me as a good stopping point because yes, I think the decorum discussion is going to be a lengthy one, so this makes sense to as a good stopping point and pick this up at a subsequent meeting. Any final thoughts, Council? Questions? Very good. Thank you, Ms. Mandershot. Let's move on to item 2.6, the City Council Policy and Issue Update. Mr. Verbrugge.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. The only update that I wanted to provide this evening is just related to the activity in St. Paul with the special session that's occurring for the legislature. We are closely monitoring that. It appears that They may be getting closer to having an agreement on a bonding bill and a tax bill, but because of some of the requirements for how the legislature operates, it probably will not be acted upon until Wednesday, if that actually happens. So rather than just having a one-day special session, it sounds like all four of the caucuses are making their best effort right now, because the likelihood is if they don't get something this month, then they likely will not get anything until the new session convenes in early 2021. Although there are still likely to be 2 more special sessions, because there's no indication that the governor is going to not extend emergency declarations each of the subsequent 30 days from now. So we will keep the council apprised if anything emerges. There is one specific change that happened today. We had a request in for a sales tax exemption related to the fire station construction projects that were in the future, and specifically our next fire station. That sales tax exemption was removed from the language today, along with requests from a number of other cities. And the likely rationale is simply that the House was removing most anything that actually cost additional money because of the fact that the state is facing a pretty significant shortfall as well. So it was not, to my understanding, a reflection of the validity of the request. Many of these exemptions have been provided in the past to other communities. It was simply a reflection that there's a current economic situation that the state is trying to grapple with. So that's the only Bloomington-specific issue to report on today.
Thank you. Council, anything to add? I see Councilmember Lohman.
Just a quick question for you, Mayor. It just seems like to me, and maybe it's just through my imagination, but it seems like crime has just sort of increased in the city of Bloomington. And I don't have the statistics or the facts to kind of back that up, but certainly I've seen things and have heard some comment on that. And I wanted to bring that up during one of these public comment period times here, or one of these issue and update kind of things. One, just not necessarily looking for an answer today, but is it my imagination that we have crime increasing? And then what are we doing as a city to address it? Are we doing something different this year as opposed to other years in the past to try to address these things? And what can a city do with something like this? So I just want to put that both to you, and maybe it's to Chief Potts. I'm not sure. I just want to throw that out there.
Well, I think you're right, and I think we had this discussion a couple meetings back that, in particular, the police calls and the crimes around some of our hotels in the community have increased. I think we have seen increases in both Part 1 and Part 2 crimes, in specific Part 1 and Part 2 crimes, and I think if we wanted to have an update on that, we'd be happy to ask the chief to come in at our next meeting and give us a full update as what it would look like citywide.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor and council members, Councilmember Lohman, we can certainly do that. I also do want to share with, I know the council is aware, but for members of the community, that the chief has been doing occasional video series as well. And so the City of Bloomington social media has just recently posted an update from the chief in terms of what's going on right now and with crime and what the police department is doing. We can certainly provide an update on that. I think that the hotels have obviously been at the forefront of conversation, several of the hotels, because of the situations related to the pandemic and the homelessness. I would also observe that there's activity occurring other places that aren't attributable to the hotels. And with a number of those things, my observation is it isn't necessarily anything that is specific to Bloomington. We have outside actors coming into the community and committing crimes here, and it fits a pattern of what they're doing around the metro area as well. So we can have the chief come in and provide a little bit more of a comprehensive update.
Yep, I think that would be helpful. So let's plan on that. Councilmember Carter?
Thank you, Mayor. So I don't want to steal you or Councilmember Coulter's thunder, but we do have our I'm trying to think all city racial equity business plan community listening session tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. So registration is available on Facebook for those who are maybe listening right now and may want to attend. I know I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. And then the other thing I wanted to ask, I've actually been asked by a couple of my parent friends if the city is going to be putting out any kind of guidance around Halloween, or somebody's like, is the city going to cancel Halloween? I'm like, I don't think that we would do. I don't think that's in our jurisdiction, but I think there's just some confusion about what people should or shouldn't be doing. And I know that there was a Facebook post earlier today from the city around kind of doing Halloween safe this year, but I'm just wondering if one of you can speak more to what the city will be providing in terms of information or communication to residents as Halloween approaches.
Thank you, Councilmember Carter. And actually, I've received a couple of emails along those lines as well. And I did see the Facebook posting earlier today about the guidance. It is not my intention or plan to in any way cancel Halloween here in the city of Bloomington. I have no intention of taking that on or would do that. But what I would do is, like we have done throughout this pandemic, is strongly encourage people just to use their best judgment and common sense and as much safety as they possibly can in terms of not only their costume choicing and their what they do, but how they approach homes, how they collect candy, how people give out candy. I would leave it up to the safety of the individuals and how they would determine it can be safest, both on a candy give out and a candy collection basis. And as you said, the city did put something on Facebook today about perhaps looking at other alternatives or different ways of doing it. And I think there's different guidance out there. But just to be clear, we're not canceling Halloween here in the city of Bloomington. If I know there are ways that it can be done and can be done safely, like much of what we're doing now, and ways that we can make it all work and make it a safe and fun event for the city of Bloomington. So, Mr. Verbrugge, anything to add to that?
No, Mr. Mayor, you covered it pretty well. There is CDC guidance on Halloween. And
CDC guidance as well. Very good. Councilmember Beloga?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I wanted to just have a little bit of a conversation about the proposed purchase by Hennepin County of the extended stay hotel on roughly Lyndale and American Boulevard, which is 3rd District. I'm getting a lot of calls, emails, stop in various public places by people expressing concerns about what is the process that needs to go on for approval, what public input there will be. Has there been a purchase agreement executed between Hennepin County and the owners of the extended stay? Will Hennepin County have public hearings prior to the closing on the hotel? Does the city need to act? What items will the city be acting upon for approval? And so on and so on. So long laundry list of questions, and not looking for a response here, but something in a reasonably short period of time so that I can provide timely and accurate information to inquiries on that topic.
All good questions, Councilmember Beloga, and questions that I've been receiving have been very similar as well. And I think you're right. The tricky part is that a lot of the questions aren't to us. I don't know if Hennepin County is going to be having a public hearing. I would hope they would, but I don't know that for certain. Here's what I'll promise you we'll do is try and answer as many of those questions. If you could even forward those on, those specific questions that you just mentioned, or we can get it off the tape here and answer those questions specifically. But what we'll do is I'll make sure that I address it on Wednesday as part of our council minute and get at all those questions that people are asking. And then we'll also make sure that we get those questions passed on to our Hennepin County Commissioner and the staff at Hennepin County. And we'll try and get some information on our website, whatever we find from Hennepin County as well. Get the details that we're able to get. But try and answer those questions using using the council minute, using our social media, using get you answers so you can answer those questions specifically to your constituents when they ask them of you.
Thank you. Great suggestion.
Very good. Councilmember Nelson.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. And I just wanted to follow up on Councilmember Beloga's comments and your comments, Mayor. I appreciate that you'll provide the information in terms of what people can do. I think a lot of people are concerned about how we're going to help those most vulnerable in our community. I think the other thing is if we're going to have the chief or somebody talk about public safety in our community, you mentioned the issues with regards to the hotels. I think that is connected in people's minds. And maybe if there's an update to the council and the community on that security issue, safety issue, that could be part of that update as well. Because I know that our police force is doing an excellent job with that issue, that our leadership is engaged with the county in terms of mitigating problems. We heard about that a couple of weeks ago. And I think people deserve to hear what they're doing if this Hennepin County proposal were to come forward, how they're engaged in that process as well. So thank you very much. I think that's an important issue.
I would agree. And thank you for that. Council, anything else? The one thing that I wanted to add, I had the opportunity this morning. I was over at Skywater Technologies when for a ribbon cutting for their new expansion of their facility, and we approved this about a year ago. I think it was in October here in the council chambers where we approved the expansion. And despite the pandemic, despite the winter weather, despite a number of things, they went great guns on it, and it got completed, and they are going to be opening it next week well ahead of schedule. And this addition is very impressive. It's about the size of a football field, 4 stories tall, 2 of them underground, and it's as clean as an operating room. And it's very impressive. They're going to be making small microchips, making them smaller and making them that they can be usable in outer space in high radiation situations. So congratulations to everybody over at Skywater. It's a great organization, great facility. It's going to be additional jobs here in the city of Bloomington. They've already got a workforce of, I think, of more than 500, and this is going to add another 50 or 60 jobs. And they're just doing great work over there. So Tom Soderman is the CEO of Skywalker, and they're doing great work. And so just wanted to point that out and call out just a great Bloomington organization, a great company that's doing great work over along the Minnesota River and they're very thankful for the new fire station close by as well. So they're appreciative of that. So anything else, council? If not, I would look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved, Councilmember Lohman.
Yeah.
We have a motion and a second to adjourn. Hearing no further discussion, Ms. Christensen.
Thank you. Beloga?
Aye.
Carter?
Aye.
Coulter?
Aye.
Lohman?
Aye.
Nelson?
Aye.
Mayor Bussey?
Aye. Motion passes 6-0. We are adjourned. Thank you all very much for the conversation this evening and the work you did. Thanks to staff for bringing the information forward and the good discussion. Thanks to everybody for watching. Have a good evening.
Night, folks.